There is a quiet unease that many thoughtful people feel but rarely name. If everything depends on God, how far can we trust our own minds? What does it mean to seek certainty when our lives rest on a will that is not our own? Al-Ghazali steps directly into this unease. He stood at a living crossroads of law, theology, philosophy, and mysticism. He learned each of these paths in depth, and yet found that none of them, taken alone, could bear the full weight of the search for truth. The philosophers sharpened the intellect, but grew overconfident. The theologians guarded belief, but could become dry and defensive. The mystics sought nearness to God, but, without discipline, could drift into illusion. His question became, how can the mind and the heart move together toward the one who created them? From this question a striking vision of the world emerges. What appears to us as solid, self-contained causality is, for Al-Ghazali, a veil. Fire does not burn by its own power, the knife does not cut by its own nature. Behind every event stands a single, free agent God. The patterns we call laws of nature are not chains that bind the Creator, but habits of divine generosity, repeated moment by moment. The order of the world is real, but its root is always a fresh gift. This does not lead him to abandon reason. It leads him to purify it. Logic is for him a precise and necessary tool, but a tool with limits. When the human mind tries to speak about God, the soul, and the unseen with the same certainty it has in geometry, it slips quietly into self-deception. Al-Ghazali does not wage war on thought. He places it back into a larger landscape of dependence and humility. For him, knowledge is never merely about winning arguments. It is about salvation and character, about the slow reshaping of the heart. The way you think forms the way you live, and the way you live opens, or closes, what you can truly know. Intellectual error is not just a mistake, it is a spiritual risk capable of dulling trust, softening accountability, and dimming hope. In this journey, we will walk with Al-Ghazali through doubt and certainty, habit and miracle, freedom and dependence. As you listen, you are invited to turn these questions inward. How do you seek truth? Where do you place your trust? And what might it mean to live, think, and hope in a world sustained, at every instant, by a generosity that is not your own? Part 1. The study of the philosophers. Across centuries of transmission and translation, a small library of Greek texts crossed into the Arabic-speaking world. Aristotle, Plotinus, commentators and compilers, voices from another civilization, speaking about being, motion, soul, and God. By the time Al-Ghazali was born, these voices had already been woven into a distinct intellectual tradition, falsafa, the disciplined study of philosophy. To imagine Al-Ghazali studying the philosophers, it helps to picture a man who already carries the weight of law and theology on his shoulders. He is not an idle reader, wandering through books for their own sake. He is a jurist, a theologian, a public intellectual. His reputation is secure. Students gather around him. Courts listen to his legal judgments. Yet in the midst of this success, there is a lingering sense that something is unresolved. The philosophers promise what every restless mind longs for: a hierarchy of sciences that lead, step by step, to certainty. Begin with logic, they say, and you will learn how to distinguish a valid argument from a confused one. Move into mathematics, and you will see how necessary truths unfold from self-evident principles. Ascend through physics and metaphysics, and you will arrive at a picture of the whole God, the world, the soul, all bound together by intelligible order. From a distance, this promise is deeply attractive. In a world where revelation is sometimes doubted, and religious practice is sometimes reduced to habit, a method that claims to prove everything from first principles seems almost like a new kind of prophecy, a revelation not of Scripture, but of reason itself. Al-Ghazali does not meet this promise with dismissal or fear. He meets it with study. In his own account, he spends years immersed in the books of the philosophers. He reads Al-Farabi and Avicenna not as distant names, but as living interlocutors. He learns their vocabulary, follows their chains of reasoning, reconstructs their systems from the inside. To study in this way requires a particular kind of patience. It is easy to refute what one has not really understood. It is harder and far more unsettling to allow another mind to guide one's own, page after page, argument after argument, until their way of seeing the world begins to feel almost natural. In this period of his life, the world around Al-Ghazali is marked by contesting claims to truth. Legal schools argue over method. Theologians dispute the attributes of God. Mystics speak of unveiling an inner experience. The philosophers enter this already crowded scene with a quiet confidence. Amid all this disagreement, they suggest there is a more rigorous path. Work carefully with concepts. Prove what you can. Suspend judgment on what you cannot. Do not hide behind tradition when demonstration is available. Al-Ghazali takes their challenge seriously because he recognizes something unsettling in himself. As a brilliant mind who has mastered legal reasoning and dialectical theology, he knows how easily intellectual skill can slide into vanity. He knows the temptation to treat opponents as foils, to value victory in debate more than transformation of the self. The philosophers, at their best, seem to offer a discipline that could restrain that vanity method, clarity, evidence. So he reads. He learns how they understand God as the necessary existent, the first principle from which all other beings flow. He studies their account of the celestial spheres, the souls of star and planet, the hierarchical structure of intellects cascading down from the first. He considers their explanation of prophecy as a perfection of the human soul, capable of receiving from the active intellect. He traces how they understand religion itself as a symbolic translation of philosophical truth for the many. At moments, this vision has an austere beauty. The universe glows with rational order. Nothing is arbitrary. Nothing is without cause. The mind, if disciplined, can rise from sensible particulars to grasp universal forms. Philosophy then becomes a form of spiritual ascent, a ladder of reasons leading the soul toward its source. Yet as Al-Ghazali follows this ladder, another set of questions emerges. If the world has no beginning, if the chain of causes stretches back without limit, what happens to the scriptural language of creation? If God acts only through necessary emanation, without choice or will in any real sense, what happens to prayer, to hope, to the cry for help from a free and responsive Lord. If prophecy is nothing more than the highest degree of natural human perfection, what becomes of the sheer gratuity of revelation, the gift that no method can guarantee? For Al-Ghazali, these are not abstract worries. They cut into the heart of how a believer stands before God. Philosophical systems may offer impressive explanations, but explanations are not the same as worship. A universe governed entirely by necessary connections, where God's role is reduced to the far-off first term in a chain, may be intelligible to the rational mind, yet it risks becoming spiritually uninhabitable. This tension is not resolved quickly. It stretches across years of study, teaching, and internal struggle. At times, Al-Ghazali is impressed by the precision of the philosopher's arguments. At other times, he senses that something essential is being lost: the immediacy of dependence on God, the vulnerability of the servant before the Lord of all worlds. Still, he refuses to caricature those he studies. He knows that many of them are sincere seekers of truth, working with the best tools they have. He acknowledges that their methods can, and often do, yield real insight into the structure of the world. To dismiss them as simple heretics or enemies of religion would be, in his view, a failure of both justice and intellect. Instead, he undertakes a more demanding task to understand their project so thoroughly that he can distinguish what is genuinely proven from what is merely asserted, what can be harmonized with revelation from what quietly undermines it. This requires not only mastery of their texts, but also a kind of double vision, the ability to see with their eyes, and then, without contempt, to step back and see them from within the horizon of faith. When he eventually writes about the philosophers, Al-Ghazali does so in more than one voice. In some works, he simply reports. He sets out their doctrines clearly, systematically, almost as a sympathetic expositor. In other works, he becomes their critic, interrogating their claims to certainty, pressing on the points where their systems rub against both reason and revelation. But the point of this long engagement is not merely intellectual. It is spiritual and existential. At stake is not only whether the philosophers are right or wrong, but how a human being should live in a world dependent, at every instant, on a free and creating God. In this light, the study of the philosophers becomes a mirror. Through them, Al-Ghazali sees both the power and the danger of the human mind. He sees how reason, when disciplined, can clarify and illuminate. He also sees how, when it forgets its dependence, it can harden into a subtle idolatry, a trust in the system rather than in the one who sustains it. It is out of this long apprenticeship that his later works take shape. His critiques are not the reaction of a stranger to philosophy, but the sober judgment of someone who has taken it, for a time, as his own home. When we read him, we are not watching a battle between ignorance and knowledge, but a struggle within knowledge itself, between a reason that trusts only itself and a reason that learns its proper place before God. For anyone today who has felt both the allure and the insufficiency of purely intellectual systems, whether philosophical, scientific, or ideological, this struggle is not remote. It is in a different language and setting, our own. The question remains, how far can we follow the philosophers without losing the humility that is the beginning of worship? and what might it mean to study them deeply, not in order to escape revelation, but to return to it with clearer sight and a more truthful heart. Part 2, Logic and the Maqasid al-falasifa. Beneath arguments and doctrines, beneath disputes about God, soul, and world, lies a quieter craft, the craft of reasoning itself. Before Al-Ghazali can ask whether the philosophers are right or wrong, he has to ask a more basic question. What does it mean to think soundly? What in fact is logic? For the philosophers of his time, logic is not a marginal discipline. It is the gate through which all the sciences must pass. Without it, knowledge risks dissolving into rhetoric, habit, and unexamined opinion. With it, there is at least the hope of building arguments whose conclusions truly follow from their premises. Al-Ghazali is deeply drawn to this promise. Logic, as he encounters it, is a kind of grammar of thought. Just as language has rules that allow words to be combined meaningfully, logic has structures that allow concepts to be joined in ways that reveal something new. To learn these structures is to gain a certain discipline of the mind, to slow down, to distinguish, to see where an argument holds and where it quietly falls apart. The text known as the Maqasid al-falasifa, often translated as the aims or doctrines of the philosophers, becomes, in this context, a remarkable document. On its surface, it is a careful exposition of philosophical teaching. It moves through logic, metaphysics, and natural science, presenting the system of Avicennian thought in an orderly way. Yet its existence already tells us something about Al-Ghazali's approach. Rather than attacking the philosophers from the outside, he first inhabits their language. He takes their categories seriously. He shows, by his own pen, that he understands how their arguments are built. He is able to do this because he accepts that logic, in itself, is not the property of any one school. It is a tool, and like any powerful tool, it can be used for many purposes. In his eyes, logic is not a rival to revelation. It is a discipline that can serve it by guarding the mind against sloppy thinking and false inference. If someone claims that a scriptural verse implies a certain doctrine, logic helps us see whether the implication really follows. If a philosopher claims to have demonstrated a conclusion that undermines core religious beliefs, logic allows us to examine whether the demonstration is genuine or only apparent. This means that, paradoxically, Al-Ghazali must become skilled in the very methods that some of his contemporaries fear. Where certain theologians regard Greek logic with suspicion as a foreign and possibly dangerous import, he sees in it a set of neutral instruments. A hammer can be used to build a home or to break it. The question is not about the hammer's origin, but about the hands that wield it. The Maqasid, then, can be heard as Al-Ghazali practicing this craft in a public way. He explains terms, distinctions, and forms of argument as the philosophers understand them. He does not yet, in that setting, raise the deeper objections that will appear elsewhere. He lets the system show itself at its best. For a modern listener, there is a lesson here about intellectual honesty. To criticize a position responsibly, one must first be able to state it in a way that its own defenders would recognize as fair. This is what Al-Ghazali sets out to do. He does not rush to denunciation. He lays the groundwork by clarifying what is at stake, what is claimed, and on what basis. Within this logical landscape, certain patterns become especially important. The philosophers speak of syllogisms, structured chains of reasoning in which, if the premises are true and the form is valid, the conclusion cannot be otherwise. They distinguish between necessary and possible, between universal and particular, between essence and existence. These are not empty refinements. They shape how one talks about everything from physical bodies to divine attributes. Al-Ghazali sees that, without training in such distinctions, it is easy to be impressed by an argument simply because it sounds complex or uses technical words. Logic slows this reaction down. It asks, what exactly is being assumed? What is being claimed? Does the conclusion really emerge from the premises, or is there a leap, a hidden gap, a smuggled assumption? At the same time, he is alert to another danger. Logic can create an illusion of mastery. Once someone learns how to construct sound arguments, there is a temptation to think that anything expressed in that form must be true, and that anything outside its reach is suspect. This is where the Maqasid, for all its clarity, remains, in Al-Ghazali's wider project, incomplete. From the perspective of faith, not all truths are reached in the same way. Some are accessible to the unaided mind through reflection on the world and on the self. Others are given only through revelation, or tasted only through spiritual practice. Logic can analyze the coherence of these claims, but it cannot generate them on its own. To mistake the tools of reasoning for the source of all truth is to confuse method with reality. Al-Ghazali negotiates this boundary with care. He affirms logic as a necessary discipline for anyone who speaks about God, law, or ethics in a systematic way. He even suggests that theologians and jurists who reject it altogether risk weakening their own traditions, leaving them vulnerable to shallow objections that could have been met with a little rigour. Yet he also insists that logic, for all its precision, has limits. It depends on starting points, on premises that it does not itself prove, but only unfolds. In the realm of geometry, these starting points may be self-evident. In metaphysics and theology, they are often far more contested. When philosophers claim that their conclusions about the eternity of the world or the nature of divine knowledge are strictly demonstrated, Al-Ghazali will later show that much rests on premises they have not, and perhaps cannot, justify purely by reason. In this way, the Maqasid al-falasifa can be seen as the calm before a storm. It is the space in which the rules of the game are set out, the board is arranged, the pieces are named. Only once this has been done can one fairly ask whether the game, as played by the philosophers, leads where they say it does. For a listener today, surrounded by appeals to data, statistics, and expert consensus, Al-Ghazali's stance toward logic carries a quiet relevance. He does not counsel an anti-intellectual retreat. He does not suggest that faith thrives best in the absence of clear thinking. On the contrary, he models a form of religious intelligence that embraces the discipline of argument while refusing to let it become an idol. Logic in his hands is a form of humility. It reminds us that not every conviction we feel strongly is actually supported by good reasons. It teaches us to distinguish between what we know, what we merely think we know, and what we must receive in trust. It allows us to engage with powerful intellectual traditions without fear, confident that truth, in the end, does not contradict itself. When we turn, in the next stage of the journey, to his great work of critique, the Incoherence of the Philosophers, it is essential to remember this foundation. The voice that challenges the philosophers is the same voice that has just presented their systems with care. The hand that dismantles their claims to demonstration is the hand of someone who has sharpened, not discarded, the tools of logic. Only from within that disciplined space can he begin to ask his most searching question, not whether reason has value, but whether it has, perhaps, quietly forgotten its proper measure. Part 3. The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Amid confident claims and intricate systems, there comes a moment when Al-Ghazali changes his tone. Having studied the philosophers, mastered their logic, and presented their doctrines, he now turns to a different task. He calls his book The Incoherence of the Philosophers. The title itself is striking. He does not speak of their error alone, but of their incoherence. This represents a failure, not simply of truth, but of inner consistency. He is suggesting that beneath the polished surface of their systems there are fractures. The house of reason they have built does not quite stand. To understand what he is doing, we must recall the deeper concern that runs through his life. That concern is the search for certainty in a world sustained at every instant by God. The philosophers have offered a path to this certainty through demonstration. Through what they regard as necessary proofs, they claim to show, with the force of logic, how the world must be and what God must be like if their arguments hold. Al-Ghazali takes them at their word. If they claim demonstration, he will test their demonstrations. If they build their system on certain premises, he will examine those premises. He does this in the light of both reason and revelation. The incoherence is not a rejection of philosophy as such, but a methodical interrogation of philosophical confidence. Specifically the confidence that human reason, working on its own, has truly grasped the structure of the ultimate. The book unfolds as a series of discussions. Each focused on a specific doctrine, he chooses doctrines that bear most directly on questions of God, world, and afterlife. For each, he reconstructs the philosopher's position. He often shows real sympathy for their reasoning. Only then does he begin to press on its weak points. His criticism operates on more than one level. Sometimes he argues that a given doctrine is simply false in light of revelation. At other times, and perhaps more importantly, he argues the doctrine has not been demonstrated. Not in the rigorous sense the philosophers themselves demand. They may believe it passionately or inherit it, but the chain of reasoning supposedly compelling assent depends on unproven assumptions. In this way, the incoherence becomes a mirror held up to philosophical pride. It asks, do you truly know this, or have you simply become accustomed to speaking as if you did? Are your arguments as conclusive as you claim, or do they rest on premises that could reasonably be denied? Take, for instance, the question of whether the world has a beginning in time. The philosophers, following a certain reading of Aristotle, hold that the universe flows eternally from God without a first moment. To them, a temporal beginning compromises stability of causes. It also compromises the perfection of the first principle. Al-Ghazali does not simply quote scripture that speaks of creation. He does something subtler. He asks whether the philosopher's own arguments for an eternal world meet their standard of demonstration. He draws on earlier critics, but develops the thought with his own clarity. Can there be an actually infinite series of past events? If not, then the idea of an eternal past becomes problematic. Are the supposed contradictions decisive? Or are they, on closer inspection, less than compelling? In pressing these questions, he is not trying to prove that the world began by reason alone. He is trying to show that reason, by itself, cannot settle the matter with the kind of certainty the philosophers promise. This pattern repeats across the book. On the nature of God's knowledge, on the resurrection of bodies, on the causal structure of the universe, he punctures the aura of inevitability that surrounds philosophical doctrines. He does not always present a full alternative explanation. Often his aim is more modest, but no less important to reopen room for revelation by deflating reason's claims. From one perspective, this is a defense of faith against overconfident theorizing. From another, it is a defense of reason itself against misuse. When human minds pretend to know more than they really can, they compromise their integrity. They smuggle opinion under the guise of proof. They forget the difference between what is necessary and plausible. The incoherence also has a juridical dimension. Al-Ghazali is not writing in a vacuum of pure speculation. He is a scholar of law, responsible for thinking about belief boundaries. He also considers unbelief and the social consequences of ideas. As he reviews doctrines, he asks not only if they are logically supported, but how they intersect with Islam's core teachings. At the end of the work, he singles out a small number of doctrines as especially grave. While many philosophical positions may be wrong yet not fatal to faith, a few are incompatible. If taught openly, he regards them as incompatible with Islam itself. To say the world has no beginning, that God knows only universals, or that there will be no bodily resurrection after death. These for him are not mere intellectual mistakes. They are denials of truths so central to the revealed message that to abandon them is to abandon the religion in substance. Here his tone changes from that of a patient logician to that of a jurist issuing a ruling. It is a sobering moment. For Al-Ghazali, ideas are not neutral. They shape how people live, how they hope, how they fear, how they respond to divine command. A belief in a world without beginning, for instance, seems like a distant metaphysical thesis. But it can erode the vivid sense of being a created being, called into existence by a deliberate act of God. Yet even in drawing these firm lines, he continues to distinguish. He distinguishes between the philosophical method and the particular doctrines some philosophers have drawn from it. His goal is not to shut down reflection, but to redirect it. Reason, properly humbled, has an honored place in the life of faith. It can clarify the meanings of revelation, respond to doubts, and guide action. It simply must not claim a sovereignty that belongs to God alone. The reception of the Incoherence over the centuries shows how disruptive this project was. Later thinkers, most famously Averroes, would write their own responses, defending the philosophers and accusing Al-Ghazali of misunderstanding or misrepresenting them. Others would take his critique as support for a more suspicious attitude toward philosophy in general. Still others, especially in Jewish and Christian contexts, would read translations. They came to see Al-Ghazali himself as a philosopher of a particular kind. But whatever the later debates, the heart of the Incoherence remains an attempt to purify the relationship. An attempt to purify the relationship between human reasoning and divine revelation. It is not a cry against thinking, but a plea that thinking recognize its dependence. It asks for a form of intelligence that knows where it ends. For a contemporary listener, living in an age of scientific confidence and technological mastery, this plea has an unexpected resonance. We, too, inhabit systems that claim great explanatory power. We, too, are tempted to assume that what can be modelled, predicted, and controlled is all that truly exists. In such a climate, Al-Ghazali's critique speaks across the centuries. It does not tell us to abandon inquiry. It asks us to remember that the deepest questions cannot be reduced. The deepest questions about why there is something rather than nothing, about what it means to be responsible before a transcendent source, about what awaits us beyond death. These cannot be reduced to what any single method can prove. In the unfolding of this series, the incoherence of the philosophers will stand at a turning point. From here, we can move to examine more closely the nature of demonstration, the subtle forms of intellectual arrogance, the delicate boundary between innovation and unbelief, and Al-Ghazali's own vision of causality and divine action. For now, it is enough to see that this work is not merely a book about other people's errors. It is a meditation on the fragility of human certainty and on the possibility of a knowing that bows, in the end, before the one who knows all things without measure. Part 4. Epistemological Hubris and the Failure of Demonstration. From within the polished arguments of the philosophers, Al-Ghazali notices something unsettling. The surfaces are smooth. The syllogisms are elegant. The confidence is absolute. And yet, when he presses on the foundations, they move. The philosophers of his time, especially in the line of Al-Farabi and Avicenna, claimed a special status for their way of knowing. They spoke of Burhan, demonstrative proof, as if it were a ladder that could carry the human mind all the way up to the highest truths. Compared to this, theology rooted in Scripture seemed, to them, clumsy and unsure, dependent on stories, and metaphors that needed reason to sort them out. At the opening of his book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Al-Ghazali calls this out as a kind of spiritual arrogance. He does not reject reasoning itself. He rejects the way it has been turned into a credential, a badge of superiority over those who rely on revelation. He points to a group among the falasifa who, buoyed by this conviction, begin to neglect the rituals, duties, and limits of the religious law. If truth can be reached by sheer intellect, why bow, fast, or submit? So he decides to meet the philosophers on their own ground. The Incoherence is not a sermon against thinking. It is a long, intricate engagement with 20 central doctrines of the philosophical movement. 16 of these belong to metaphysics, claims about God, eternity, the soul, and the structure of reality. 4 lie within natural science claims about the heavens, causality, and the nature of motion. His aim is very focused. He does not simply ask, are these doctrines true? He asks something sharper, do the arguments for these doctrines really deserve to be called demonstrative? Do they meet the high standard that the philosophers themselves set for Burhan? For Al-Ghazali, demonstration is not just any persuasive reasoning. It is a tightly controlled structure built from premises that are themselves certain and necessary. These premises must be acknowledged as such by any rational mind, not just by members of a particular school. A valid demonstration, in this sense, cannot be wrong. To claim demonstration is to claim necessity. When he inspects the philosophers' proofs, he finds a different picture. Many of their arguments, he says, rely on premises that are far from universal. They are assumptions that circulate within a small circle of enthusiasts, or that are inherited from Greek authorities and repeated without fresh scrutiny. These premises might be plausible. They might even be true. But they are not self-evident. They have not themselves been demonstrated. This is where he introduces a painful word for the philosophers, tactled uncritical imitation. The Philosopher accuse theologians and jurists of doing tactled, of following tradition without proof. Al-Ghazali quietly turns the charge back on them. You too, he says, are repeating the words of your founders, clothing them in the language of proof, but trusting them more than you actually examine them. One of his clearest examples is the question of whether the world has a beginning in time. Avicenna and al-Farabi defended the pre-eternity of the world. This is the idea that the universe has always existed alongside God in an unbroken, beginningless sequence of events. They offered careful arguments for why an actual infinite past is possible, and why the very nature of a necessary, unchanging cause seems to demand an eternal effect. Al-Ghazali responds with arguments and counterexamples drawn partly from the Christian philosopher John Philoponus. Philoponus's critique of Aristotle had already filtered into Arabic discussions. Can an actual infinite sequence of past events really be completed? Can we meaningfully count or cross an infinite distance? If the past is actually infinite, what does it mean to say that we have arrived at the present moment at all? He does not merely insist that the philosophers are wrong. He insists that their arguments fall short of demonstration. At best, they reach the level of dialectic, where plausible premises are debated and refined, but where certainty is not achieved. They can be accepted or rejected by a reasonable person. That is not enough to override the apparent teaching of revelation. Interestingly, Al-Ghazali sometimes agrees with the conclusions that he criticizes. On some questions about the soul, or the structure of the heavens, he is willing to say later that the philosophers may in fact be right. Yet even here, he makes the same point: they have not shown these things with the kind of necessity they claim. Their confidence outstrips their proof. Where then do these philosophers really get their knowledge of the unseen? Al-Ghazali suggests an uncomfortable answer. Much of what they say about God, the human soul, and the higher realms originally comes from prophets. From Abraham, Moses, and others before them. These teachings leaked into the books of ancient sages, who then passed them down as if they were the fruits of unaided reason. The philosophers, trusting their books, inherit these insights, but missalable their source. For him, this matters because it distorts the posture of the knower. If what you truly have is borrowed light, it is dangerous to pretend that you yourself are the sun. To claim that reason alone has climbed to a certain truth is to forget the dependence. The dependence, the transmission, and the guidance that have actually shaped your mind. The charge of epistemological hubris is not a narrow attack on a single school. It is a warning about a pattern that can recur in any age, the tendency of a successful method to mistake its own reach. Whenever a discipline begins to speak as though its tools alone can arbitrate reality, Al-Ghazali would ask it to slow down and examine its premises. In our own time, this temptation appears in different clothes. It appears in the assumption that whatever cannot be measured does not matter. It appears in the casual belief that if an idea has the aura of science, it must be beyond question, even when it rests on fragile assumptions and shifting data. We too are capable of confusing persuasive arguments with demonstrations, of treating strong likelihoods as certainties. Al-Ghazali does not respond to this with cynicism. He does not say that, because the philosophers overreached, nothing can be known. On the contrary, he writes elsewhere that valid rational demonstration is never wrong. His critique is not of reason, but of its misuse. His demand is that the label of demonstration be reserved for what truly deserves it. This stance places him between two extremes. On one side stands the philosopher who believes his syllogisms contain the divine. On the other stands the skeptic, who declares all reasoning arbitrary and powerless. Al-Ghazali is unwilling to surrender to either. He wants a mind that works carefully, and a heart that remains aware of its dependence. By the end of the Incoherence, he has examined 20 philosophical doctrines in this light. Most of them, he concludes, may be false or speculative, but they do not by themselves tear someone away from the faith. They are innovations, errors, or at worst, dangerous tangents. But among these 20, he finds 3 claims, especially associated with Avicenna, that he cannot treat as mere mistakes. They do not only fail the test of demonstration, they also directly contradict what he sees as the most basic commitments of the Quran and the Muslim community. In these 3 points, he believes. The philosophers have not only stretched reason beyond its limits, they have stepped beyond the boundaries of belief itself. It is to these 3 that we now turn. Part 5. The 3 Heresies of Avicenna. Far more concerning to Al-Ghazali than the style of the philosophers' arguments was the substance of a few of their conclusions. One can be mistaken without leaving the faith, he insists. But there are some claims that, if affirmed and taught, reshape the entire image of God, the world, and the human being in a way that Islam cannot recognize. At the end of the Incoherence of the Philosophers, Al-Ghazali gathers his verdicts. From the 20 doctrines he has discussed, 3 stand out as not only false, but religiously catastrophic. All 3 he attributes above all to Avicenna, the most systematic and influential of the Muslim peripatetics. The first is the claim that the world has no beginning in time. The second is that God knows only universals, not the concrete details of individual lives. The third is that there will be no bodily resurrection after death, only a purely spiritual survival of souls. Each of these ideas springs, in Avicenna, from deep philosophical concerns. Each is woven into a grand vision of reality in which God is the necessary existent, the source from which all being flows. This forms an ordered, hierarchical cascade, and each of these ideas for Al-Ghazali strikes at one of the pillars of Islamic faith. Consider the first, the eternity of the world. Avicenna wants to safeguard a God who is perfect, unchanging, and necessary. He reasons that such a being cannot at some point begin to act after not acting, because that would imply a change in God. If God's nature is eternal and his power is eternal, then whatever flows from him must, in some sense, be eternal as well. The relationship between God and the world becomes like that between the sun and its light. As long as the sun exists, its radiance exists. There is no moment before. The universe on this picture does not exist by itself. It depends on God at every instant. Yet it has no first moment, no temporal boundary at which it is called forth from absolute non-existence. Time itself stretches back without a first day. Al-Ghazali's response has two layers. First, as we saw earlier, he denies that the arguments for this eternity reach the level of demonstration. They rely on controversial premises about infinity, change, and causality. It is not self-evident, he says, that an unchanging cause must have an eternal effect. Second, and here the stakes rise, Al-Ghazali insists that revelation presents a very different picture. The Quran speaks of a created heaven and earth, of a time when they were not, and then came to be by divine command. The early Muslim community, he argues, has reached a consensus that the world is created in time. To deny this is not simply to propose a speculative metaphysical model. It is to overturn what Al-Ghazali takes to be a clear teaching of Scripture and communal faith. For Al-Ghazali, the danger is not only doctrinal. If the world has always existed, one can begin subtly to experience it as almost as necessary as God himself. The sharp sense of having been summoned from nothing, of being radically contingent and utterly dependent, begins to erode. Creation becomes an eternal backdrop rather than an event of sheer gift. With that, humility and gratitude risk becoming abstractions. The second contested doctrine concerns God's knowledge. Avicenna is determined to protect God from change and multiplicity. If God were to know each fleeting event as it arises, moment by moment, wouldn't his knowledge be constantly updated and multiplied? To avoid this, Avicenna describes God's knowledge as simple, unchanging, and eternal. God knows all of reality by knowing himself as its cause. From this, Avicenna draws a sharp distinction. God knows universals perfectly, the essences and general patterns of things, the unchanging structures within which events unfold. But he does not know particulars in the way we do, as this individual leaf falling now, this person's silent prayer tonight, this unnoticed act of kindness on a crowded street. Particulars on his account are known to God only as they are contained within the universal patterns. To philosophers worried about divine immutability, this can sound elegant and pious. To Al-Ghazali, it sounds like the death of a living relationship with God. How can one pray, he asks implicitly, to a Lord who does not truly know your specific joys, losses, and secrets? What meaning do the Quran's constant invocations of God as hearing and seeing have? if they do not extend to the smallest detail of each human life. Here again, Al-Ghazali charges the philosophers with contradicting revelation, which depicts God as the one who knows what is hidden in the breasts, who responds to the distressed caller. He is described as being nearer than the jugular vein, a God sealed off from the particular twists of each story is in his eyes, not the God of Islam. The third doctrine concerns the afterlife. Avicenna emphasizes the immaterial nature of the human soul. For him, the soul is an intellectual substance that survives the body's decay. In the next life, its happiness or misery is determined by the extent to which it has actualized its intellectual potential and detached itself from bodily concerns. In this scheme, the vivid Quranic images of resurrection, graves opening, bodies reconstituted, paradisal gardens, corporeal pains and pleasures take on a largely symbolic role. They are, Avicenna suggests, pedagogical tools for the masses who cannot grasp purely intellectual delights and sufferings. The real resurrection is the soul's separation and its contemplative state. Al-Ghazali sees in this a direct assault on the third pillar of faith, the concrete reality of life after death as described by revelation. If bodily resurrection is reduced to allegory, he fears, then the texture of moral life is transformed. The felt certainty of a coming judgment, in which each limb will testify, and each deed will carry weight, dissolves into something far more abstract. Al-Ghazali is not blind to the philosophical puzzles here. The reassembly of bodies, the nature of identity through death and decay, the compatibility of physical pleasure with spiritual fulfillment, these questions are real. But he insists that they must be addressed within the frame set by revelation, not by dissolving the frame itself. It is on the basis of these three doctrines, the eternity of the world, the restriction of God's knowledge to universals, and the denial of bodily resurrection, that Al-Ghazali issues his most severe judgment. In his capacity as a jurist, he appends to the Incoherence a brief legal opinion: whoever teaches these three doctrines publicly is an unbeliever and an apostate, subject under classical law to capital punishment. To modern ears, this can sound harsh and alarming. It is important to recognize its context. Al-Ghazali is not writing as a distant academic commentator. He writes in a society where theology, law, and public order are deeply intertwined. Ideas about God and the afterlife shape not only personal spirituality, but the authority of law. They also shape the cohesion of community and the willingness of individuals to restrain their desires. For him, these three teachings are not speculative luxuries. They are socially dangerous. If the world has no beginning, if God is indifferent to particulars, and if the afterlife is merely symbolic, then the religious law itself can begin to appear optional. This makes it a set of cultural practices without deep metaphysical backing. The ordinary believer, hearing such doctrines from admired intellectuals, may slip into indifference or quiet disbelief. Even here, however, there is nuance. Al-Ghazali does not pronounce a blanket verdict on every philosopher or on every one of Avicenna's followers. He insists that each doctrine must be assessed on its own merits. A thinker might hold many errors and yet remain within the faith. Another might be orthodox in many matters and yet cross a boundary at a crucial point. Nor does he deny Avicenna's intellectual brilliance. In other works, Al-Ghazali draws on Avicenna's psychology, metaphysics, and ethics. He can praise the acuity of a mind, even as he condemns specific conclusions as unbelief. This combination of admiration and sharp critique is part of what makes his engagement so enduring. Beneath the legal language of heresy and apostasy, what is at stake is a vision of reality. Is the world a contingent creation, called from nothing by a free act of God? Is God intimately aware of each particular creature, each breath and thought? And will there be a bodily resurrection in which justice is fully, tangibly manifest? Al-Ghazali answers yes to each of these. His verdict on the three doctrines of Avicenna is his way of saying that, without these affirmations, the shape of Islamic faith is altered beyond recognition. They are, in his view, non-negotiable edges of the map, but such edges need to be drawn with care. After the Incoherence, Al-Ghazali becomes increasingly aware that simply condemning individual doctrines is not enough. Muslims disagree on many issues. Philosophical ideas continue to spread. Without a clear standard, accusations of unbelief can multiply and become a tool for factional struggle. So Al-Ghazali turns to a new task to articulate, as precisely as he can, what truly lies at the boundary of the faith, and what falls within the broad, often messy space of tolerated difference. It is this attempt to define the boundaries of belief that shapes one of his most important later works. Part 6. Defining the boundaries of belief. In the years following the incoherence of the philosophers, Al-Ghazali shifts from attacking particular doctrines to asking a more general question. When exactly does an opinion cross the line from error into unbelief, and who has the right to say so? Religious communities, then as now, are prone to draw sharp lines. It is tempting to declare that those who differ from us on contested points are outside the fold. Al-Ghazali had seen the damage this could do: fractured communities, hardened polemics, and a constant anxiety about one's own standing before God. To respond, he writes a relatively short but deeply influential treatise, usually translated as the decisive criterion for distinguishing Islam from clandestine unbelief. The title itself is ambitious. He is not trying to settle every doctrinal debate. He is trying to clarify the standard by which debates are judged. His starting point is strikingly minimalist. Only teachings that violate what he calls the fundamental doctrines, the usul al-aqaid, should be deemed unbelief. He narrows these fundamentals down to three: the oneness of God, the prophecy of Muhammad, and the reality of the afterlife as taught by the Quran. Anything that directly denies or empties out these three can be called unbelief. Anything else, however serious the error might be, should not be taken as expelling someone from Islam. It may be innovation, it may be a grave mistake, but it does not break the basic bond that defines membership in the community. This move creates a wide middle space. In that space live the disputes about divine attributes, about the details of predestination, and the precise nature of the soul, about fine points of scriptural interpretation. Here Al-Ghazali urges, we must be patient. We may argue, we may criticize, but we should not rush to takfir, the declaration that someone is a disbeliever. Each teaching, he says, must be judged on its own terms. Is it sound? Is it compatible with revelation, even if its origins lie in a philosophical school? If so, Muslims should be willing to adopt it. If it is wrong but does not contradict the core fundamentals, it should be tolerated as an internal disagreement. This posture has important consequences. It opens the door for a much broader acceptance of Aristotelian elements within Islamic theology and ethics. Al-Ghazali himself makes extensive use of logical techniques, philosophical psychology, and certain metaphysical distinctions, showing no fear of contamination by philosophy. He fears the unthinking rejection of truth, wherever it appears, and the careless branding of opponents as unbelievers, a practice he viewed as deeply damaging. At the same time, he does not ignore the political dimension of doctrine. His refutations of the philosophers and of the Ismailis both have a distinctly social concern. In each case, he worries that ordinary believers, or half-educated admirers of these movements, may come to think that the religious law is optional. He worries it may be seen as a husk that can be shed once one has attained higher insight, leading to disregard for established religious practices. With the Ismailis, the worry takes a different form. They criticized Sunni theology for its disputes and disagreements, arguing that rational argument is inherently unstable. For every proof there is a counterproof, for every argument an equal and opposite argument. No rational attempt to interpret Scripture can claim certainty. Only the divinely guided Imam, in their view, can provide decisive meaning, making Sunni theological reasoning seem arbitrary. To describe this, they use the phrase takafu al-adilla, the equivalence of proofs. From this equivalence, they concluded that the Sunni use of reason was arbitrary and unreliable. Al-Ghazali took this challenge very seriously. If all reasons are equal, if no argument can be stronger than its rival, then theology collapses into pure will and authority. In response, he reaches again for Aristotle, not because Aristotle is sacred, but because his tools help make an important distinction. Not all rational arguments are of the same kind. Some are rhetorical and seek only to persuade. Some are dialectical and work with commonly held opinions. But some, the demonstrative arguments, the burn, genuinely compel assent when their premises are granted, providing a path to certainty. For Al-Ghazali, reason al-aql is at its clearest when it operates at this demonstrative level. Such reasoning does not float free from revelation. It is itself a gift from the same God who sends prophets. A valid demonstration, he insists in a letter to a student, is never wrong. This conviction leads him to a subtle but powerful rule. It is impossible, he says, for a true demonstration and a true revelation to conflict. Both are from God. If there appears to be a contradiction, then either the reasoning is not truly demonstrative, or the text is being read in a way that goes against its intended depth. From this, he draws a principle for interpretation. If, and only if, a conclusion is established by valid demonstration, and that conclusion clashes with the outward, literal sense of a scriptural passage, then the passage must be interpreted symbolically. The words still speak truth, but they do so through metaphor, analogy, and image, offering a deeper understanding of the divine. He illustrates this with verses that ascribe a hand to God or describe him as sitting on a throne, demanding careful interpretation. Demonstrative arguments in theology, drawn from the nature of divinity, show that God cannot be a body and cannot be confined to a place. Therefore, these verses must be understood as symbols hand, as power or generosity, sitting as dominion and sovereignty. To read them literally would be to contradict what reason, firmly guided, has seen, thus creating an unnecessary conflict with divine truth. At the same time, he erects a barrier against unrestrained allegory. If no valid demonstration overturns the literal sense of a passage, then it is not allowed to force a symbolic reading upon it. Not every difficulty or discomfort is a license to spiritualize. Revelation retains its authority. Reason helps to locate where symbolic depth is necessary, not to dissolve the text into our preferences. This rule for reconciling reason and revelation will echo through later Islamic thought. Many theologians with rationalist leanings adopt it in substance, even when they modify its details. It provides a framework in which philosophical reflection and scriptural fidelity need not be rivals, fostering a more harmonious intellectual tradition. Not everyone is satisfied. The Hanbali scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, writing more than a century later, criticizes Al-Ghazali's approach. He objects to the suggestion that, in a conflict between reason and scripture, reason has priority. He also questions whether Al-Ghazali's arguments truly deserve that name. For Ibn Taymiyyah, any perception of conflict arises from bringing in foreign premises that revelation itself does not accept. On the other side, Averroes, the great Andalusian philosopher, embraces Al-Ghazali's rule about interpretation, but disputes his judgments about what has been demonstrated. In Averroes' view, Aristotle had already proven the eternity of the world. Since true demonstration cannot conflict with revelation, and since the Quran nowhere unambiguously affirms temporal creation, he concludes that eternity must be accepted both philosophically and, in a deeper sense, religiously, aligning reason with scriptural understanding. Al-Ghazali himself is aware that the scriptural language about creation is not always explicit in philosophical terms. He leans, instead, on the consensus of Muslim theologians that the world has a beginning. Interestingly, in his later, more systematic work on the boundaries of Islam, he no longer foregrounds the question of pre-eternity in the same way. The emphasis shifts back to the three fundamentals: God's unness, Muhammad's prophecy, and the reality of the afterlife, underscoring their primary importance. What emerges from all this is a picture of boundaries that are neither arbitrary nor all-encompassing, but carefully considered and defined. Al-Ghazali wants the circle of Islam to be wide enough to hold disagreements, even sharp ones, on many issues. He wants the charge of unbelief to be used sparingly, reserved for positions that truly undercut the core of the faith. At the same time, he refuses to treat doctrine as a purely private matter. What we believe about God's relation to the world, about divine knowledge, and about judgment shapes not only our inner spirituality, but the health of our communities. Ideas can encourage humility and responsibility, or they can subtly license neglect and self-justification, impacting societal well-being. Seen in this light, his attempt to define the boundaries of belief is an ethical project as much as a doctrinal one. It is about learning to disagree without eagerness to expel, to argue without delight in labeling the other as lost. It is about knowing when a mistake is still a mistake within the family, and when it has torn the fabric that holds the family together. For a listener today, much in Al-Ghazali's context will feel distant, yet the questions he raises remain close. How narrow or wide should the circle of belonging be? When do we protect a tradition by drawing firm lines? And when do we honour it by allowing a range of interpretations? And how can reason and revelation, mind and heart, operate together without either claiming a total victory over the other? These questions will accompany us as we continue through his reflections on reason, revelation, the afterlife, ethics, and the reshaping of the soul. For now, it is enough to see that, for Al-Ghazali, the true defense of faith lies not in silencing thought, but in thinking carefully about where belief begins and where, at last, it breaks. Part 7. Reason, Revelation, and Symbolic Interpretation. At first glance, it can seem as though Al-Ghazali's struggle was simply a clash between scripture and philosophy, but the real tension he faced ran deeper. It was about trust. When the Quran speaks and the mind seems to say something else, which voice deserves our final loyalty? And can that question even be asked without tearing the unity of truth apart? By the time he writes on this theme, Al-Ghazali has already drawn some sharp lines. He has said that only a small set of teachings truly mark the boundary between faith and unbelief. The oneness of God, the truth of Muhammad's prophecy, and the reality of the life after death. Around these core doctrines, however, lies a vast field of interpretation, disagreement, and doubt. In that field, he is surprisingly generous. Errors may be serious. They may even be innovations. But they are not automatically unbelief. What worries him is something else. He fears two opposite temptations. On one side, people who wrap themselves in philosophy may begin to feel exempt from revealed law, as though refined intellect has risen above obedience. On the other, movements like the Ismailist claim that all rational argument is unstable, that every theologian's proof can be met with an equal and opposite proof, and that only a hidden, infallible guide can deliver certainty. One side makes the mind the only judge, the other side declares the mind almost useless. Al-Ghazali refuses both options, turning instead to a stricter vision of reason. Drawn from the Aristotelian idea of demonstration, not every argument deserves the same respect. Some are mere persuasion. Others are clever but fragile. A true demonstration, for him, is something rare, a chain of reasoning, built from premises that are themselves certain, leading to a conclusion that cannot be otherwise. Where such a demonstration exists, it is not just probable, it is binding. From this, a bold principle emerges. A genuine rational demonstration, he says, can never be wrong. And revelation, being the speech of God, cannot be false. Therefore, a real conflict between the two is impossible. If an argument appears demonstrative and contradicts a verse of Scripture, then one of two things must be mistaken. Either the argument is not truly demonstrative, or our reading of the verse is too shallow. Out of this, he builds his rule for symbolic interpretation. If the mind, operating at its highest level, shows that the literal sense of a revealed text is impossible for God, if, for example, reason establishes that the Creator cannot be a body limited in space, then the scholar must move beyond the surface. The Quranic references to God's hand, or to his sitting on the throne, become symbols pointing to power, generosity, authority, and nearness, rather than limbs and location. Under the pressure of certain knowledge, the text's meaning deepens rather than breaks. Yet he is equally clear about the limits of this move. Symbolic interpretation is not a freedom to reshape revelation whenever it becomes uncomfortable. It is a responsibility that applies only when there is a real, compelling impossibility in the literal reading, established by flawless reasoning. Where such impossibility is absent, the outward meaning must stand. To allegorize beyond necessity is, for him, a kind of theft. It steals the clarity of God's address to ordinary believers and hides it behind a curtain of private speculation. This is why Al-Ghazali insists that not everyone should engage in deep interpretation. The masses, he believes, should be left with a simple, evident sense that guides their worship and conduct. The task of reconciliation between reason and revelation belongs to a small group of trained minds, people who know the tools of logic, the language of Scripture, and the dangers of the ego. For them, symbolic reading is like a strong medicine, sometimes required, always powerful, and never to be taken lightly. His contemporaries did not all accept this balance. Text-focused critics accused him of putting reason on a throne above revelation, especially when he denied, for example, that God literally sits on a throne in the way bodies do. Philosophers closer to Ibn Rushd, in contrast, took his principle but pushed it further. If demonstration allows symbolic interpretation, they argued, and if Aristotle has truly demonstrated that the world has no temporal beginning, then that pre-eternity is not only philosophically sound, but religiously required. Under the same rule, Al-Ghazali rejects that claim, pointing not only to the spirit of the Quran, but also to the consensus of the Muslim community. They agree on the world's creation, and that agreement itself becomes a kind of evidence. What becomes clear is that the real argument often lies in an earlier step. What counts as a genuine demonstration? Where exactly does human reasoning reach necessity, and where does it still move in the realm of the probable, behind the shared language of reason and proof lie divergent assessments of the mind's reach? For a modern listener, this may feel familiar. We often speak about science and faith as if their boundaries were obvious, as if the word evidence meant only one thing. Al-Ghazali invites us to slow down, to ask what do we really know with certainty? Where are we still guessing? And when a revealed text seems to clash with our current understanding, are we dealing with something firmly demonstrated, or with a model that may itself be revised? Underneath his technical discussions stands a spiritual concern. He wants to protect both the majesty of revelation and the integrity of the mind. If you reject reason altogether, you risk turning faith into blind imitation, vulnerable to any charismatic claim. If you enthrone the mind without limits, you risk bending revelation until it merely echoes your own preferences. His rule of symbolic interpretation is an attempt to let both lights shine without one extinguishing the other. In this light, every apparent conflict between reason and Scripture becomes an occasion for refinement. Sometimes the intellect must admit its overreach and step back from claims it cannot truly prove. Sometimes the believer must admit that their first reading of a verse was too flat, too caught in images meant to be windows, not walls. In both cases, the goal is not victory in debate. It is a deeper harmony between the way we think and the way we listen to God. And so, at the heart of Al-Ghazali's approach lies a quiet, disciplined trust that truth is one, and then be patient enough to trace its unity. Do not rush to declare contradiction. Do not rush to declare certainty. Instead, allow reason and revelation to interrogate one another under the conviction that both, when rightly understood, lead away from the illusions of the ego and toward the reality of the one who speaks the world into being in every moment. Part 8. The Science of the Afterlife. In Ghazali's eyes, the most serious question a human being can ask is not how the world began or how the heavens move. It is, what becomes of me when this life ends, and how are my present choices shaping that unseen future? The afterlife is not, for him, a distant appendix to theology. It is the horizon against which every action in this world receives its true weight. When he leaves the prestigious teaching chair in Baghdad and turns inward, this horizon comes into sharp focus. He looks back on years spent in disputation and discovery and senses something missing. Correct ideas on their own have not freed him from anxiety. Mastery of arguments has not guaranteed sincerity. He encounters Sufi writings that insist on a simple but unsettling truth. On the day of judgment, God will not ask you to recite your theories. He will weigh your heart and your deeds. From this realization, Al-Ghazali begins to speak of a science of the afterlife. This is not a science in the modern experimental sense. It is a structured body of knowledge about what leads to salvation and what leads to ruin, grounded in revelation and corroborated by the inner experience. It tells you which habits purify the heart and which corrode it, which forms of worship bring you nearer to God and which are hollow shells. These hollow shells are often performed for reputation or routine. His monumental work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, is shaped by this new orientation. It is not arranged around abstract questions of creed, but around the concrete rhythm of a Muslim life, ritual practices, social dealings, inner diseases of the soul, and inner states that lead to salvation. Across 40 books, he asks, how does this particular act, prayer, charity, marriage, earning a living, speaking, eating, remembering God, appear when held up to the light of the last day? The contrast he draws is stark. To live only for this world is, in his language, to mistake the road for the destination. This life is short, fragile, and constantly slipping from our grasp. The next life is enduring, vast, and inescapable. Measured against eternity, worldly pleasures are like sparks in the night, flaring and vanishing. Yet those fleeting sparks seal our state in a realm that does not end. Because of this, he warns against an ethics that is merely external. It is not enough, he says, to conform outwardly to the law. while nursing greed, envy, pride, and hypocrisy inside. On the day of judgment, the veil of social appearances falls. Deeds are weighed not only by their form but by their intention. A generous gift given for praise may carry little weight. A small kindness done in obscurity for God alone may be immense. The science of the afterlife, then, is a science of intention and awareness. It teaches you to remember that every choice is being written, that nothing is lost. He uses vivid images to make this remembrance tangible. The world becomes a marketplace whose doors are about to close. Death is the herald announcing the end of trading. Whatever currency of good works and purified motives you have stored becomes your only wealth thereafter. What you hoard for this world stays behind. What you give for God's sake travels with you. This perspective reshapes how hardship and ease are understood. When the afterlife is real in your imagination, calamities are no longer pure misfortune. They can be occasions for patience, trust, and turning back to God, all of which carry weight on the scale. Comfort and success, in turn, become tests rather than simple blessings. They may cultivate gratitude and generosity, or they may nourish arrogance and forgetfulness. Without the afterlife as measure, it is easy to misread both. Al-Ghazali's turn to this science does not abolish his earlier concern for knowledge. It redirects it. The worth of any knowledge now lies in whether it helps you die well. Legal expertise, theology, and even philosophy must be judged by this standard. Do they guide you toward obedience, humility, and hope in God's mercy, or do they feed self-importance and argument for its own sake? If they do the latter, then, in his language, they become sciences of this world, however refined their content may be. Within this framework, belief in the afterlife is more than assent to a doctrine. It is a training of perception. To truly believe is to begin seeing the unseen consequences of actions as clearly as you see their visible outcomes. To hear an insult and, after a first sting, remember that your response is being recorded. To feel the seduction of a small dishonesty and recall that what seems like an easy gain may become a heavy burden later. This is not constant fear, but constant lucidity. From a distance, such a life can look severe. Yet for Al-Ghazali, the science of the afterlife is also a science of hope. It tells you that nothing good is wasted. A moment of sincere regret wipes away years of heedlessness. A single tear shed in private, out of longing or awe, may outweigh spectacles of worship done for show. The scales of the next world are subtle, but they tilt decisively toward mercy for those who turn back. Seen this way, the question of what is real shifts quietly. The visible world, with all its weight and colour, becomes a passage. The invisible world, which we can only imagine through revelation and reflection, becomes the true home. To take Al-Ghazali seriously is to let that reversal work on you, not to withdraw from life, but to move through it as someone who knows that every meeting, every contract, every moment of solitude is part of a much longer story that does not end at the grave. And so the unease he began with, the sense that our minds are fragile before God's will, finds here a different answer. You cannot control your lifespan, You cannot foresee all the turns of fortune, but you can learn, through the science of the afterlife, to attend to what God has placed in your care, your intentions, your choices, your response to whatever comes. In that attentive stewardship, lived under the gaze of the hereafter, the mind and the heart begin to move together toward the one who will receive them at the end. Part 9. Virtue Ethics and the Disciplining of the Soul. Beyond rules and prohibitions, Al-Ghazali is concerned with something more elusive: what kind of person you are becoming. Laws can tell you what to do or avoid in particular situations. They can map out the permissible and the forbidden, but they cannot by themselves guarantee that goodness flows from you with ease, or that your heart is aligned with the acts your body performs. In his revival, Al-Ghazali turns repeatedly to the language of character. Actions, he says, are like fruits. They grow from inner qualities that have become firm and stable within the soul. A single generous act does not yet make you generous. A burst of patience in one moment of trial does not yet establish you as patient. Virtue for him is a settled disposition, a way of being from which good deeds emerge effortlessly, without constant internal struggle. This way of thinking brings Al-Ghazali close to what we might call virtue ethics. He criticizes an approach to religion that reduces everything to external conformity with the law. This approach is administered by jurists who specialize in technical details but ignore the inner landscape. Such scholars, he says with severity, are scholars of this world. They can tell you how to execute a contract or perform a ritual correctly, but they cannot guide you to transform your heart. Against this, Al-Ghazali presents a more demanding vision. The prophet, in his view, is not only a lawgiver, but the supreme model of character. To follow him is to imitate his humility, his mercy, his courage, his forbearance with those who wronged him. It is to train the soul until acting as he acted becomes natural. The Sharia remains the frame, but within that frame, the real work is the slow reshaping of the self. Here Al-Ghazali draws, often silently, on philosophical traditions he has absorbed. He speaks of the soul as composed of different forces. These include the appetitive drive that seeks pleasure, the irascible drive that defends, and the rational faculty that sees beyond immediate impulse. Left without guidance, appetite can become greed and lust. The defensive force can harden into anger and cruelty. Virtue is not the destruction of these drives, but their balance. Courage, for example, lies between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lies between miserliness and waste. Modesty lies between brazen shamelessness and paralyzing self-contempt. Each virtue is a kind of equilibrium point where a power of the soul is neither suppressed nor unleashed blindly, but governed by reason and directed toward what God loves. Al-Ghazali rejects the idea that perfection means annihilating anger or desire. These are woven into our nature and serve important purposes. Without desire, there would be no drive to marry, work, or preserve life. Without a capacity for anger, there would be no resistance to injustice or protection of the vulnerable. The true task is not to erase these inclinations, but to discipline them, transforming them into strengths guided by reason and faith. To explain this, Al-Ghazali reaches for a vivid metaphor, The soul, he says, is like a young, untrained horse. It is strong, energetic, and full of potential. But if you leave it to wander, it will trample fields, throw off its rider, or tire itself out in pointless runs. Through patient training, firmness, repetition, and occasional gentleness, the same horse becomes a noble mount, carrying you swiftly and safely to your destination. The disciplined soul is like this. Its powers now serve a clear purpose, guided by a steady hand. This training is what Al-Ghazali calls riadat al-nafs, the disciplining of the self. It involves practices both outward and inward. Outwardly, you force yourself, at first, to act against unhealthy inclinations, to give when you would rather withhold, to speak gently when you are inclined to snap. You also lower your eyes when curiosity pulls them elsewhere. Inwardly, you engage in self-scrutiny, holding a kind of daily accounting. What moved me today? Where did I follow anger or appetite blindly? Where did I remember God, and where did I forget? Over time, repeated acts form habits, and habits crystallize into traits. At the beginning, generosity may feel forced, patience may feel artificial. But if you persist for the sake of God, these actions begin to sink into the heart. The line between effort and nature blurs. You become, slowly, the kind of person for whom doing the right thing is less of a battle, more natural. Yet Al-Ghazali is careful not to leave this process entirely in the hands of reason and will. He never forgets that true virtue is in the end a gift. You can prepare, struggle, and structure your life wisely, but the turning of the heart ultimately belongs to God. That is why he places such emphasis on prayer, remembrance, and companionship with the righteous. Being in the presence of someone whose character is luminous can stir a longing that arguments alone cannot awaken. At the same time, he does not grant reason the power to define on its own what is ultimately good or bad. We often praise or condemn actions because of their visible benefits or harms to society, but such judgments can mislead. From the standpoint of eternity, good means what is rewarded by God in the next life, and bad means what is punished. Only revelation can disclose those final measures. Virtue ethics for him is not independent of theology. It is grounded in a revealed map of what leads toward God and what leads away from him. In this, once again, Al-Ghazali lets mind and revelation meet. Reason helps identify the mechanisms of the soul and how habits are formed. It also identifies the balances to be struck between extremes. Revelation tells you which targets are worth aiming for, which loves and fears should be central. Together they shape a path where disciplining the self is not self-hatred, but a form of mercy. This is mercy for your future self who will stand before God, and mercy for those around you who will live with the person you are becoming. If you listen closely, a question begins to echo beneath Al-Ghazali's pages. What traits in you are still wild horses? Which angers, desires, and ambitions run without reins, even if they remain hidden from others? And what might it look like? Not in theory, but in the texture of your days, to begin their training. Not to break them, but to harness them so that they too become part of the journey toward the one who created them with wisdom and placed in them the possibility of beauty. Part 10. Prophecy, Psychology, and Human Potential. Under dim moments of self-awareness, many people notice something curious about the mind. It does not always move step by step, slowly, from one thought to the next. Sometimes it leaps. A sudden understanding appears while walking, or a problem untees itself in a dream. You might sense someone is about to call, or feel a strong pull away from a seemingly attractive choice. For Al-Ghazali, this question was not a side curiosity, it lies very near the center of religion itself. Prophecy, after all, is not something foreign to the human race. The prophet is one of us. He eats, sleeps, feels joy and grief, and walks in markets. Yet through him, revelation descends. Through him law, wisdom, and guidance flow. How is this possible? What kind of soul can receive speech from God without being shattered by it? To answer this, Al-Ghazali turns to psychology, not as a modern science of behavior, but as an attempt to map the inner structure of the soul. He borrows, adapts, and reshapes ideas from philosophers like Avicenna, who propose the soul has distinct powers or faculties. Some collect images from the senses, others combine and interpret them, and others grasp abstract meanings. In most of us, these powers work ordinarily. But in the prophet, they reach an extraordinary intensity and balance. In this vision, prophecy is not a magical interruption of nature. It is the blossoming of human nature at its highest possible degree, under God's will. Al-Ghazali speaks of three key capacities. When united in exceptional strength, these capacities make prophecy possible. The first is an intellectual capacity, a luminous readiness to receive truth. Where others must study slowly, argue and compare, the prophet can see a complex reality in a single, clear act of awareness. Imagine someone who, glancing at a complicated page of numbers, sees at once the pattern others need hours to calculate. Now extend that image to the deepest truths, the reality of God, the structure of the world, the inner workings of the soul. The prophet's mind, in Al-Ghazali's account, can receive such realities directly, as if engraved upon a polished mirror. The second is an imaginative capacity. This faculty can clothe bare abstract truths in images, stories, and symbols that ordinary people can grasp. It is not fantasy in the sense of random invention. It is more like a translator, turning intellect's language into everyday parables. When a prophet speaks of gardens and fire, of light and darkness, this is not to reduce truth. It is to make truth walk among people, so that farmers, merchants, rulers, and children can carry it in their hearts. The third is a practical or effective capacity. Through it, the prophet's soul stands in such harmony with the cosmos that external events can change in response to his prayer, command, or presence. Rain comes in drought. A ship is saved from sinking. A person's heart turns from cruelty in a single, decisive moment. Al-Ghazali is careful not to make this mechanism crude. The prophet is not a rival force competing with God. Rather, God has woven into creation that, at the hands of a prophet, certain unusual effects may occur. These are signs, not tricks. They are part of the way God confirms and honors his messengers. All three faculties, Al-Ghazali insists, exist in every human being in a faint form. You and I know something of sudden insight. We dream dreams that touch upon future events, even if only in small ways. We notice, at times, that our inward state seems strangely linked to what unfolds around us. D-Age view and true dreams are tiny windows. They show that the path from ordinary consciousness to prophetic consciousness is not a jump between species. It is a difference of degree, purity, and divine choosing. From here, Al-Ghazali draws an important conclusion about human potential. Between the ordinary believer and the prophet, there is a broad middle ground. In that middle ground stand the friends of God, the saints and Sufi masters, whose lives are marked by unusual clarity, wisdom, and intimacy with the divine presence. They do not receive law, they do not found a religion, but they are granted inspiration, inner guidance resembling prophecy, while remaining below it. This inspiration is not a private license to ignore revelation. It is more like a deepening of understanding within the frame that revelation sets. Where the mind, working alone, often remains cold and abstract, inspiration warms it, unites it with the heart, leading a person to see the real weight of their actions. Through this, Al-Ghazali subtly reorders the ranks of knowledge. The prophet and the saint do not simply know more propositions than the philosopher. They know differently. Their knowledge is saturated with awe, surrender, and love. This is also where Al-Ghazali quietly parts ways with Avicenna. For Avicenna, the perfected thinker and the prophet ultimately share the same content of truth. One reaches it by slow demonstration, the other in a flash. But for Al-Ghazali, this is not enough. The prophet, and to a lesser degree the saint, have access to realities the unaided intellect cannot even frame as questions. Their knowledge is not just quicker, it is higher. To explain this, Al-Ghazali often uses sensory metaphors like tasting. Imagine someone who has memorized every description of sweetness, read recipes, and can recite chemical formulas. Beside him stands someone who has actually tasted honey. The first can speak, classify, and argue. The second can be silent and still know more. The Arabic word he turns to is darku, tasting. Real spiritual knowledge is like tasting. It requires contact, transformation, and a change in the knower. It cannot be reduced to definitions. Prophetic and saintly knowledge then arise where the soul has been disciplined, purified, and reoriented toward God. This is why Al-Ghazali's psychology never floats free from ethics. The work of disciplining the soul described in chapters on virtue, restraining anger, ordering desire, training the mind to watch the heart is preparation for higher knowing. A soul cluttered with greed, pride, and distraction is like a tarnished mirror. Even if light falls upon it, the image is distorted. A soul polished through remembrance, repentance, and humble service can receive that same light and reflect it clearly. Here psychology becomes a bridge between human effort and divine grace. On one side is what we can do, cultivate habits, seek knowledge, keep company with the truthful, and struggle against the lower impulses of the self. On the other side is what can never be forced, the sudden opening, the intuition that reorders a life, the serenity that descends in the midst of fear. Al-Ghazali refuses to promise that every seeker will become a saint, or that discipline can manufacture inspiration. Yet he also refuses the idea that the extraordinary is reserved for a chosen few, entirely without relation to their inner work. God gives as he wills, but he has also taught us where his gifts are most often found. This understanding of human potential has practical consequences. It means that education, for Al-Ghazali, is not simply the transfer of information. It is the careful nurturing of the soul's faculties, so they can respond to revelation in the fullest possible way. Teaching law without humility, or theology without sincerity, is like training the eye while neglecting the heart. The student may become sharp in argument and blind in judgment. It also reshapes how we think about our own flashes of insight. Part 11. Divine Law and Public Benefit. In tracing the shape of a religious life, people often think first of rules. Do this, avoid that, pray at these times, do not eat these foods. At a distance, law can seem like a fence built to keep desire in check and chaos at bay. Al-Ghazali knew that picture well. He had mastered the intricate debates of jurists, who devoted their lives to drawing that fence with precision. Yet he also saw how easily law, when treated as a self-contained system, can lose sight of its own purpose. For him, divine law is not a frozen code dropped from the sky. It is a mercy aimed at two horizons at once: salvation in the hereafter and well-being in this life. Both matter, but they are not equal. The afterlife is the measure. This brief world, fragile and passing, is the field in which that eternal harvest is planted, tended, and finally reaped. Because of this, Al-Ghazali is sharply critical of a certain kind of legal mind. He speaks of scholars of this world who know the branches of law with great detail, but whose hearts are heavy with rivalry, pride, and greed. They can argue over the conditions of a contract while neglecting their own covenant with God. Their learning is real, but its orientation is skewed. It bends towards status rather than surrender. Still, he does not dismiss jurisprudence. On the contrary, he treats it as one of the noblest sciences because it guides action. And in his vision, what you do, not only what you believe or intend, shapes your destiny. The question is how to restore law to its rightful place as a path to God rather than a game of technical mastery. One way Al-Ghazali does this is by revisiting a basic question: what makes an action good or bad? The philosophers and some theologians had argued that human reason can, at least in some cases, grasp moral value on its own. We can see, they say, that justice is good and cruelty is evil, even without a revealed text. Al-Ghazali resists this claim. Our judgments, he argues, are almost always tangled with our sense of benefit. We call something good when it seems to serve our interests, and bad when it harms them. But what appears beneficial now may, in the vast perspective of the afterlife, be a disaster. What seems harsh in the moment may be a hidden mercy. True moral value, then, cannot rest on our shifting intuitions. It must be anchored in revelation. A good action is one that God has promised to reward. Bad action is one that he has warned will be punished. Only he sees the full spread of consequences in this world and the next. Human reason, left alone, confuses what is pleasant with what is praiseworthy. Yet Al-Ghazali does not leave reason silent. Instead, he gives it a different role. Once revelation has set the aims of human life, reason helps to understand those aims, apply them to new cases, and organize society accordingly. It becomes an instrument of obedience, rather than a rival source of legislation. This is where his notion of public benefit enters. When God revealed law, Al-Ghazali argues, he did not issue arbitrary commands. He sought specific goods for human beings in both realms. By studying the Quran and the prophetic example, we can discern some of these goods. Al-Ghazali famously gathers them into 5 essentials that must be protected if a community is to flourish: religion, life, intellect, offspring, and property. Religion must be preserved because it is the bridge to the afterlife. Without it, people lose the very map that directs their existence. Life must be protected for obvious reasons. Without life, no worship, no gratitude, no moral growth can occur. Intellect must be safeguarded because it is the tool by which we understand revelation, reflect upon ourselves, and make meaningful choices. Offspring or lineage must be secured so that families can form, children can be raised in stability, and the human story can continue with dignity. Property must be respected not as an absolute right, but as the material space in which responsibility, generosity, and trust can be exercised. Laws that protect these 5, he says, embody public benefit. Laws that harm them undermine the very purposes for which Sharia was given. This does not mean that whatever seems to serve these goods, in our judgment, automatically counts as divine law. But it does mean that when jurists face new situations not directly addressed in Scripture, they are not left entirely without guidance. They can ask, does this rule preserve or damage those essentials? Does it help people to live lives in which worship, justice, and moral growth become easier or harder? In this way, Al-Ghazali quietly broadens the scope of jurisprudence. He opens a space where reason can consider benefit, not as the final judge of right and wrong, but as a servant of revealed aims. The jurist is not merely a reader of texts. He is also a guardian of the conditions under which souls can seek God. This vision casts familiar legal details in a different light. The prohibition of alcohol, for example, is not only about a substance. It is about preserving intellect and protecting families. Rules regarding marriage, inheritance, and modesty are not only about controlling desire. They are about securing lineage and shielding people from the loneliness and chaos that follow when bonds are broken carelessly. Financial regulations are not only about preventing theft, they are about structuring the circulation of wealth so that envy, desperation, and arrogance do not tear the social fabric apart. At the same time, Al-Ghazali remains wary of reasoning that drifts too far from the anchoring texts. He knows how easily public benefit can be claimed to justify almost anything. A ruler might declare a policy oppressive but beneficial, and then compel jurists to endorse it in the name of the common good. To prevent this, Al-Ghazali's use of benefit is cautious. He implies that a benefit that flatly contradicts clear revelation is an illusion. True benefit cannot oppose the very law that was revealed to secure benefit in the first place. This balance between text and benefit mirrors, on the level of law, the balance he seeks in the soul. Just as the heart must be humbled before God yet actively engaged in self-discipline, so the jurist must be humbled before revelation, yet actively engaged in reasoning. Passive literalism, which refuses to consider the aims of law, can produce cruelty. Untethered rationalism, which trusts its own sense of benefit above the revealed word, can dissolve religion into ethics of convenience. Seen from this angle, divine law is not simply a restriction, it is architecture. It builds a world in which the higher possibilities of the human soul are protected. Without certain outer forms, regular prayer, fasting, rules of trade, ordinances of family life, most people will not, in practice, find the inner stability and clarity. This stability and clarity are needed for serious spiritual work. These forms create pockets of time and patterns of behavior in which remembrance can take root. Al-Ghazali's notion of public benefit also carries a quiet challenge to the listener. It asks you to look at your own environment and ask, does the way I live, my schedule, my habits, my economic and social choices support the protection of these 5 essentials, or quietly erode them? Even apart from formal law, you build a kind of personal Sharia through the routines you accept. That unwritten law either opens space for worship, reflection, family bonds, and fair dealing, or it closes it. In the end, for Al-Ghazali, divine law is one of the most tangible traces of God's will within history. It is the pattern by which a community is invited to align itself with the deeper order of the cosmos. To obey that law is not merely to comply with an external authority. It is to step into a stream that, if followed with sincerity, carries the soul toward its true home. Public benefit, then, is not an end in itself, but a byproduct of living under a mercy that extends beyond this short life. The law cares for bodies and societies so that hearts may have the chance to wake up, turn, and endure. In a world where many feel torn between personal freedom and religious obligation, Al-Ghazali offers a different frame. Freedom is not simply the absence of constraint. It is the ability to choose the good with clarity and steadiness. The structures of divine law, when understood through the lens of their purposes, do not crush that freedom. They cultivate it. By shielding the fragile conditions under which a human being can learn to desire what truly benefits him, here and in the life that does not end. Part 12. The Clockwork Universe and Divine Decree. Between ticking seconds of an ordinary clock, it is easy to forget how astonishing time really is. The hands move, the gears turn, the days pass. We speak of patterns, cycles, and laws as if the universe were a vast mechanism that simply runs once set in motion. Al-Ghazali accepts some of that imagery. He often speaks as if the world were an intricate device whose parts fit together with meticulous precision. But for him, that image hides something deeper. This clock never runs on its own. Its energy does not come from an initial push long ago. It comes, freshly and deliberately, from a living will at every moment. At the core of his view is a strict sense of divine determination. God, he teaches, is the only true agent. Everything that happens, the fall of a leaf, the beat of a heart, the rise of an empire, the flicker of a thought occurs according to his will and creative act. There are chains of causes in the world, links that we can observe and describe. But none of these causes stand on their own. They are more like channels through which a single river flows. To explain this, Al-Ghazali asks us to imagine a patient inquirer following a trail of events. A spark touches dry cotton. The cotton blackens and burns. One might say, with common sense, that the fire burned the cotton. But what set the fire to that place at that time? What allowed the cotton to catch? What governed the properties of heat and fuel in the first place? If one could trace this sequence backward, through air and motion and celestial arrangements, through the structure of matter and the movements of the heavens, one would eventually reach the highest realm of being, and beyond that, the Creator himself. In that sense, nature is a web of secondary causes, all of which depend at every instant on the primary cause. God is, in Al-Ghazali's phrase, the one who makes the causes act as causes. They have no independent power to produce their effects. The knife cuts because God creates, cutting when its edge meets flesh. The medicine heals because God creates, healing when it reaches the body. The pattern is stable enough that we can rely on it, but the stability is itself a habit of divine generosity, not a cage that confines him. In his great work on revival, Al-Ghazali develops this into a picture of the universe as a planned and measured apparatus. To make that image concrete, in his later writings he turns to something familiar in his time, a water clock. Such a device does not simply appear. It passes through stages. First there is design. The maker of the clock forms, in his mind, a complete plan. He knows where each gear, weight, and channel must be placed, how quickly the water must flow, how the motion of one part will affect the next. Nothing in this plan is vague. It is detailed and ordered. In Al-Ghazali's language, this corresponds to God's eternal judgment, his timeless knowledge of all that will be. Second, there is actual construction. The plan passes from thought to crafted form. The wood is cut. The vessels are shaped. The mechanisms are assembled. In his theological vocabulary, this stage aligns with decree, the moment at which what is known in eternity is given existence in time. Third, there is the continual provision of energy. The clock does not move unless water is supplied at the right rate. Too much and it breaks. Too little and it stops. The maker must maintain the stream. In Al-Ghazali's analogy, this is like God's ongoing act of giving being to everything that exists. It is what he calls predestination, the careful, continuous measuring out of existence, so that the universe unfolds according to the pattern contained in his knowledge. The point of this image is not to trap God within a mechanism, but to underscore his intimate involvement with every part of the process. The universe is not a machine slowly winding down, abandoned by its maker. It is more like a finely balanced clock that functions only because its maker is, so to speak, pouring existence into it at every instant. This view has profound consequences for how Al-Ghazali understands human action. Just as physical events occur within chains of causes, so do our choices. When you decide to speak or remain silent, that decision arises from a set of motives, hopes, fears, loves, and habits that have been shaped by your past experiences, your knowledge, and your character. Those, in turn, were shaped by your upbringing, your encounters with teachers and texts, your exposure to suffering or ease. Every point in that network, he says, is tied back, ultimately, to God's creating will. From the inside, you feel yourself free. You deliberate, weigh possibilities, and then choose. But what happens from the outside? From the outside, beneath the gaze of God's timeless knowledge, that movement of your will is one event among others, already present in the divine plan. There is, in Al-Ghazali's determinist language, no gap in the chain. No moment when something simply springs into being without God as its creator. This raises, naturally, the question of responsibility. If my motives and choices are themselves created, how can I be held accountable? Al-Ghazali's answer lies in how he links causality to the structure of the afterlife. Your actions are not arbitrary signs to which God later attaches reward or punishment by sheer whim. They are causes whose effects unfold beyond death. To persist in injustice is to carve certain traits into the soul. Those traits, when the veils of this world are lifted, become your torment. To cultivate sincerity, patience, and compassion is to shape a soul capable of tasting nearness to God. That nearness is your reward. In this way, determinism does not erase moral meaning. It deepens it. The same God who decreed your acts also decreed the way those acts would echo in your being. You are responsible not because you stand outside the divine will, but because you stand within it as a creature endowed with awareness, warned by revelation, and given the capacity to respond. Still, Al-Ghazali is keenly aware of the spiritual danger in these doctrines. To dwell on divine decree in a careless way can lead to fatalism or despair. One might say, if everything is written, why struggle? His answer, shaped by the Quran and the prophetic example, is to uphold two levels at once. On the level of ultimate truth, everything comes from God. On the level of daily conduct, you must act as if your choices matter, take means, plan, and repent. He often illustrates this with simple examples. If someone refuses to work, claiming to trust in God, he would call this foolishness, not faith. Trust means tying your camel and then relying on God for the outcome. The tying is part of the chain of causes that God has customarily chosen to bring about safety. To abandon it in the name of decree is to misunderstand both decree and trust. So in practice, Al-Ghazali encourages people to live within the apparent order of the world. Plant seeds if you wish to harvest. Seek medical treatment if you are ill. Study if you desire knowledge. Pray, for prayer itself is one of the causes God has set within his plan to change the course of events. The believer sees causes not as rivals to God, but as instruments in his hand. This double vision, seeing the clockwork, and at the same time the hand that holds it, can reshape how you interpret your own life. The success you enjoy is not simply the product of hard work and talent. It is a portion measured out for you. The difficulties you face are not random misfortunes. They are tests and openings designed according to a wisdom that you may not grasp in the moment. This does not mean you should blame God for injustice committed by human beings. It means you should not treat any event as meaningless. Everything can be folded back into the conversation between you and your Lord. Al-Ghazali's adoption of certain philosophical ideas is visible here. He accepts with Avicenna that there are ordered levels of reality, earthly events linked to celestial movements, all dependent on higher intellects and finally on God. He accepts that causality gives the world a kind of intelligible structure, but he refuses to let that structure harden into a necessity that binds God's will. For him, the universe is indeed a marvel of order, perhaps even the best arrangement that could have been. Yet that order is chosen. God is not compelled by his own nature to create this world. He freely wills it, and could have willed otherwise. In such a universe, divine decree is not a blind fate. It is a wise, purposeful determination. The script of reality is not written by an impersonal necessity, but by a knowing author who sees every line at once. To live under that decree is to inhabit a story in which your actions are both determined and meaningful, both caused and consequential. For someone seeking certainty, this can be unsettling. It means that the mind, by its own power, will never fully grasp how freedom and determination fit together. There is a point at which explanation must give way to trust, but for Al-Ghazali, that trust is not an abdication of thought. It is the completion of thought. After reason has traced the limits of its own reach, it hands the remaining unease over to a heart that has learned, through practice, to rely on God. To picture this, return to the image of the clock. Stand before it. Watch the steady drip of water, the turning of wheels, the quiet advance of the hands. Understand as much as you can the beauty of its design. Then remember that none of this would move if the Maker withdrew his sustaining will. Your own body, your memories, your desires are part of that same device, held in being by the same generosity. From that awareness, a different way of living can emerge. You still make plans, but you no longer cling to them as if they were the ultimate ground of your security. You still feel joy and grief, but you begin to see both as waves upon a deeper sea. You speak, act, repent, and hope. All the while knowing that every breath is a gift measured out, one more drop in the clock of your days. And as each drop falls, it carries you, with unerring precision, toward the meeting that decree has written for every soul. Part 13, the best of all possible worlds. In Ghazali's vision of reality, the world is not an accident we happen to inhabit. It is a crafted arrangement, measured and weighed by a wisdom that escapes us but never abandons us. When he repeats the striking phrase that there is impossibility, nothing more wondrous than what is, he is not offering a slogan of easy optimism. He is trying to describe how a finite mind might live inside an infinite plan. To call this the best of all possible worlds is not to say that it is the softest, kindest, or most comfortable world. We do not need a philosopher to tell us that it is not. Lives fracture, injustice spreads, desires remain unanswered. When Ghazali looks at these same facts, he does not deny their sting. Instead, he asks a slower question. If God is perfectly wise and perfectly free, what kind of world would such a God choose to create? And what would it mean to trust that choice while still feeling the sharp edges of our experience? Earlier, when Ghazali compared the universe to a great clock, he was already hinting at an answer. A clock is not judged by how pleasant it looks on the wall. It is judged by whether it fulfills its purpose with precision The designer first conceives a plan, then he builds the mechanism according to that plan. Finally, he supplies it with the right kind of energy in the right amount, so that the entire system moves as it was meant to move. A clock that runs too fast or too slow is not a better clock. It is a failure of design. Ghazali extends this image to the whole of creation. In the silence of eternity, before there was a first instant to be called before, God knows, in one undivided act of knowledge, the entire history of the universe. Every leaf that will fall, every word that will be spoken, every thought that will flicker through a human mind. For God, this is not a sequence of surprises. It is a single, timeless comprehension. There is no past, present, or future that can arrive and alter that knowledge. There is only our gradual, walking through what is already known. From within that eternal knowing, God judges. He weighs possibilities we cannot see. He considers arrangements of worlds we could never imagine. He surveys lives that never will be, tragedies that never will unfold, joys that will never be tasted, and he chooses. The technical language for this, in Ghazali's writings, is divine judgment, decree, and predestination. First the judgment, the evaluation of what configuration of events best serves the ultimate purpose of creation. Second, the decree, the decision that this world, with its structure and history, is the one that will be. Third, the predestination, the measured bestowal of existence, moment by moment, that brings the decree into unfolding reality. It is here that the phrase, best of all possible worlds, begins to take on its deeper meaning. Best for Ghazali does not mean pleasant in each part. It means most fitting for the end God intends. The end is not simply that creatures exist and move. His end is that they come to know him, love him, and freely choose the good under conditions of real struggle. A world without temptation would remove the possibility of sincere resistance. A world without suffering would remove the possibility of patience, compassion, and trust formed in the dark. A world without ignorance would remove the drama of learning, of searching, of turning back after error. In this sense, the very features that trouble us may be the conditions of the virtues we most admire. Courage presupposes danger. Forgiveness presupposes fault. Generosity presupposes need. Ghazali does not say that evil is an illusion, or that pain is secretly good, if only you look at it correctly. He holds something subtler and harder. He says that God, who sees infinitely more than we do, has allowed no unnecessary suffering into the structure of reality. If a hardship exists, then within the total pattern of the world it serves a wisdom that could not be realized otherwise. The problem is that we almost never see that pattern while we are inside it. This does not solve the philosophical problem of evil in a way that ends all questioning. Ghazali is not interested in closing every intellectual door. He is more interested in the spiritual orientation that a certain way of thinking cultivates. If the world is a random collision of forces, then trust is foolish and gratitude is naivete. If it is a rigid machine that even God could not have made otherwise, then prayer is empty and hope is thin. But if the world is chosen freely by a wise and generous Creator, then a different posture becomes possible. One can struggle against injustice while still trusting that existence itself is a mercy. Here Ghazali parts ways with some of the philosophers he otherwise respects. For thinkers like Avicenna, the structure of the world flows necessarily from God's very nature. Once God exists, the world follows, like light from the sun. God does not decide between real alternatives. The order of beings pours out of him with a kind of metaphysical inevitability. Ghazali fears what this does, quietly, to our understanding of worship. If God could not have done otherwise, then his creativity is no longer a free gift. It becomes a predictable expression of what he is, the way heat is a predictable property of fire. So Ghazali insists on something different. God is not bound by his own essence in the way a natural object is bound by its properties. His will is not a passive reflection of what he is, it is a living act that chooses. There were genuine possibilities that never came to be. Worlds that could have existed remain, forever uncreated, known only to God. Among those worlds, he freely preferred this one. The phrase best of all possible worlds now means the world freely chosen by a will that could have chosen otherwise, yet did not. In that preference we glimpse not only power and wisdom, but also a kind of love. This emphasis on divine freedom has another consequence. It protects the believer from turning the patterns of nature into a cage for God. When we see the sun rise every morning, it is tempting to say that it must rise, that reality itself would break if it did not. Ghazali replies, no, it rises because God, once again, says be to a universe that could have ended a moment ago. The regularity is not a barrier that shuts God out. It is the sign of a habit in his giving. He is free to break that habit, and sometimes does, in what we call miracles. But most of the time he sustains it so that we may live, plan, and learn. Seen in this light, calling the universe a clock is not meant to reduce us to small cogs in an indifferent machine. It is meant to convey precision and reliability on the hand of a watchful maker. Every gear, no matter how small, has its place. No moment is wasted. Even what feels, from within our limited line of sight, like pure loss or chaos, can be a hidden adjustment within a larger timing we do not yet understand. The point is not that we should guess what that timing is. The point is that we are never outside it. For Ghazali, this understanding does not cancel human responsibility. The fact that God predetermined every event does not mean that our choices are unreal or our character is irrelevant. Rather, our choices are among the very things God weighs when he designs the world. He creates us as beings who decide, who intend, who love and who refuse. He knows which of those decisions we will make, and he shapes the story of the world around that knowledge. In this way, destiny and accountability do not oppose one another. They meet in the mysterious intersection between divine knowledge and human experience. What matters in the end is how such a vision shapes the soul. To believe that this world is the best possible stage for your encounter with God is not to deny sorrow. It is to refuse despair. It allows a person to stand in the middle of confusion and say, I do not see the pattern, but I trust that there is one, and that it is not cruel. It invites a form of patience that is not passive resignation, but endurance joined with effort. You still strive to remove harm, to alleviate pain, to correct injustice. You simply no longer imagine that the imperfection of the world is proof of the imperfection of its maker. In the quiet spaces of his revival, Ghazali returns again and again to this mood of trust. The believer, he says, walks through a universe that has been arranged for his ultimate good, even when its immediate appearances say otherwise. To live inside that conviction is to see reality not as a random storm, nor as a cold necessity, but as a carefully set table, sometimes holding sweetness, sometimes bitterness, yet always prepared by the same generous hand. That is what it means for him to inhabit the best of all possible worlds. Part 14. The Problem of Causality. Many readers first meet Ghazali as the theologian who denied causality. The caricature is simple. Philosophers believe in causes and effects. Ghazali shows up and smashes their neat chains of necessity, insisting that God alone does everything directly. But if we listen carefully to his own writings, we find something more measured and more searching. He is not trying to remove order from the world. He is trying to ask what kind of order can exist in a universe ruled by a free and omnipotent God. Causality at first sight seems to be the most obvious feature of our experience. Touch a flame and pain follows. Drop a stone and it falls. Swallow a medicine and the fever fades. Over time we build habits of expectation around these patterns. We begin to say that the fire burns, that gravity pulls, that the drug heals. Yet hidden inside these sentences is a philosophical claim that the first event has, in itself, a power that necessitates the second. The fire must burn the cotton unless blocked. The stone must fall unless interfered with. The cause carries a right over its effect. For the philosophers Ghazali studied, this necessity is not merely a practical assumption. It is a structural truth about the universe. Everything in the created world, they say, is contingent in itself. It might have existed or not existed, but once it does exist, its behavior flows necessarily from what it is. Iron, once created, must have certain properties. A human soul, once created, must seek certain goals. The chain tightens as one moves upward. The entire hierarchy of beings, with their natures and their activities, is itself necessitated by the first principle. God becomes the ultimate explanation for why there is a world at all, but within that world the causal sequences take on a life of their own. Why does this trouble Ghazali? Not because he dislikes order, or because he wishes to throw people back into chaos and superstition. Why it troubles him is that necessary causality quietly reorders our priorities. When the human mind becomes convinced that every event is locked into place by the inherent powers of things, several spiritual consequences follow. First, it becomes tempting to treat God as a remote architect who wound up the machine and then stepped back. The world runs, so to speak, on its own steam. Second, we begin to feel that our expectations are entitled. If I perform a certain action, I deserve a certain outcome, because the causes are on my side. Ghazali sees how easily this mindset erodes humility. It also endangers our sense of dependence on God. If fire burns by its own nature, then why pray for it not to burn in an exceptional case? If provisions come through agriculture and trade by their own inherent powers, why look beyond them for daily sustenance? Gradually what we call nature occupies the mental space that belongs to trust. God is still affirmed in speech, but the heart leans on causes. There is also a more explicitly doctrinal concern. In the tradition of prophecy that Ghazali defends, miracles are not ornamental curiosities. They are signs that confirm the truthfulness of a messenger. A staff turning into a snake, a dead person returning to life, a body ascending to the heavens, these are events that break ordinary expectations. If, however, one insists that causes and effects are bound by an iron necessity, miracles become impossible in principle. Or if one accepts their occurrence, one must reinterpret them as hidden natural processes we simply do not understand yet. Either way, the theological weight of the miracle dissolves. So the problem of causality for Ghazali is not a narrow technical issue. It is a meeting point of metaphysics, ethics, and devotion. How we interpret the relation between fire and burning, medicine and healing, effort and success, shapes the way we pray, the way we hope, and even the way we fear. This is why he takes the time, in a work as practical as the Revival, to trace chains of causes backward, from human actions through the natural world and up into the heavens, until he reaches God as the ultimate source. That makes any cause effective in the first place. In that tracing, Ghazali does not deny that we perceive regular sequences, nor does he deny that, for the purposes of daily life, we must rely on them. He acknowledges what experience teaches, that certain things consistently follow from others. What he challenges is the leap from regular sequence to necessary connection. The fact that A is always followed by B does not, on its own, entitle us to say that the A contains within itself a power that compels B into existence. All we are strictly entitled to say is that God, in his habit, creates B whenever A appears. This may sound, at first, like a thin distinction. In practice, the fire burns the same, the stone falls the same, the medicine heals the same. But in the interior life of the believer, the difference is profound. If the connection is necessary, then even God is, in a certain sense, bound to respect it. If the connection is a habit of God, then he may continue it or break it as he wills. The external pattern is the same, the inward posture is transformed. Habit becomes occasion for gratitude, not entitlement. And any instance of preservation from harm can be read as a fresh act of mercy, not merely as the predictable outcome of impersonal forces. Another dimension of Ghazali's concern lies in human freedom. The philosopher's belief in necessary causation often comes with a strong form of determinism. Once the total state of the universe is given at a moment, and the natures of things are fixed, everything that follows is necessitated. In such a picture, the human being may still choose in some sense, but each choice is itself rigidly fixed by prior causes. Ghazali shares, in his own way, a commitment to divine predetermination, yet he wants to articulate it without, turning the world into a closed physical system. When he insists that God is the only true agent, he is not simply shifting determinism upward. He is reframing agency itself as something that creatures only borrow, and that God can support or withhold at any moment. It is important to see that Ghazali does not call for abandoning the study of causes. He personally mastered logic and the philosophical sciences. He used them carefully where they belonged. Farmers should learn what conditions improve their crops. Physicians should discover how bodies respond to treatments. Judges should investigate what actions lead to harm or benefit in society. To ignore such knowledge would, in his view, be a failure of gratitude. The problem arises only when we mistake these useful patterns for independent powers and then build our hearts upon them. Thus the problem of causality is, in Ghazali's hands, a call to recalibrate where we finally rest our trust. We still plant seeds, but we no longer think that the earth and the rain have power apart from God's continuous giving. We still seek medicine, but we no longer imagine that healing springs from the drug itself. We still work for our livelihood, but we do not take our effort as a guarantee. Each link in the chain becomes a site of dependence, not certainty. In the chapters that follow, Ghazali will sharpen this critique into a more technical doctrine, exploring occasionalism and the atomic structure of time. There he will develop a picture of the world in which no created thing has the kind of enduring causal power that could bind its creator. For now, it is enough to notice the direction of his thought. He is not trying to make the world less intelligible. He is trying to make room, within its intelligibility, for a constant awareness of the one who sustains it. To see that every cause is itself caused at each instant is to be returned again and again to the source from which all things come. Part 15. Occasionalism and the atomic structure of time. At times, Ghazali seems to ask us to imagine the world in slow motion, not the slow motion of a camera, where movement is stretched but still continuous. Rather a world that advances in discrete steps, like the frames of an old film, passing one by one through the projector. Between each frame there is a tiny gap, an absence the eye cannot see. In that gap, for him, lies a profound theological claim: nothing carries itself from one moment into the next. Existence is not a river that flows under its own power. It is a series of gifts, continuously renewed. The doctrine that expresses this vision is often called occasionalism. In its classical Islamic form, associated with the Asharite theologians, it begins with a radical rethinking of what the world is made of. Physical objects, on this view, are not solid blocks with stable inner natures. They are bundles of tiny, indivisible units, atoms, not in the modern physical sense, but in a philosophical one. These atoms are the bare carriers of qualities. They occupy space, but by themselves they have no colour, no movement, no weight, no warmth. All of those features are accidents that God attaches to them. An accident in this vocabulary is anything that can exist only in the atoms of something else. The redness of an apple, the sweetness of honey, the motion of a bird's wing, the joy that passes through a human heart, all of these are accidents inhering in atoms. They do not persist by their own strength. According to the Asharite picture, no accident endures from one instant to the next. When a moment finishes, its accidents vanish with it. If in the next moment the apple is still red and the bird is still in flight, that is because God has created a new set of accidents that exactly resemble the previous ones. This has an unsettling consequence. The continuity we see in the world, of movement, of character, of natural processes, is not a continuity of things carrying themselves along. It is a continuity of divine choice, What we call the movement of a ball across a field is, on this view, a sequence of fresh acts of creation. In each instant, God recreates the ball slightly further along its path, with new accidents of position and motion. The speed of the ball is just another pattern in how much its position changes from one moment to the next. From a distance, this can sound like an abstract game detached from what life feels like. Ghazali does not treat it that way. For him, the atomic structure of time and the continual creation of accidents are ways of making explicit what faith already whispers, that nothing in creation is self-sufficient for even the blink of an eye. If accidents could survive on their own from one moment to the next, then the world would contain, in miniature, a kind of independence. A movement that started could, at least in principle, continue without God. The heart of occasionalism is to deny that possibility. There is no movement, no colour, no thought, no intention, that exists on its own even for an instant. This is where time itself becomes significant. Instead of picturing it as a smooth line, the Asherites divide it into atomic moments, indivisible units of duration. Each moment is like a tiny stage on which God places a world. Then that moment ends. The stage is cleared. In the next, he places a new world, almost indistinguishable from the previous, or sometimes astonishingly different. The impression of a single, flowing universe comes from the tight alignment of these successive stages, not from any underlying current running through them. To many philosophers, this scheme seemed extravagant. Why multiply acts of creation when one would suffice? If God gave the ball a certain motion, why should that motion not simply continue until something stops it? If he granted the human soul certain faculties, why should they not function according to their natures? Behind these objections lies a different picture of divine power. In the philosopher's model of secondary causality, God creates things with stable essences and then uses them as instruments. Fire is made so that it burns. The sun is made so that it shines and warms. The human will is made so that it chooses under the influence of motives. Once these natures are in place, they can be relied on. Causes become secondary agents through which the primary, divine causality is exercised. Ghazali is not blind to the appeal of this Avicennan picture. Secondary causes seem to secure the intelligibility of the world. They allow science, prediction, and practical reasoning to unfold without having to think about God at every step. He acknowledges in his own way that for all practical purposes we must treat causes as if they are stable. Yet he is unwilling to let this practical convenience harden into a metaphysical claim that binds God. The moment we say that fire burns by its nature in such a way that even God cannot make it touch something without burning it, we have stepped, for Ghazali, over a line. Occasionalism is his way of backing away from that line without abandoning the reality of patterns. When he says that God is the one who makes causes to be causes, he means that what we call a cause has no efficacy apart from the divine will continually pairing it with its customary effect. The atomic structure of time is the metaphysical framework that makes this intelligible. If each moment is a fresh creation, there is no need to imagine an inherent power stored inside things, pushing the future into one shape rather than another. All the pressure comes from above, not from within. This does not, however, erase the distinction between better and worse ways of acting. Ghazali is not saying that because God recreates the world at every instant, human choices become meaningless. On the contrary, our choices are among the very accidents that God creates in us, moment by moment. We intend, we decide, we move, and these acts have consequences because God, in his established habit, follows certain inner states with certain outer events. Intending to strike and actually striking are both created by him, but they are linked in stable ways. Moral responsibility enters because these links are known in advance. We can anticipate that cruelty will harm, that generosity will help, that neglect of duty will bring loss. We are judged, then, not on our ability to cause outcomes in some independent sense, but on our alignment or misalignment with the known habits of God. From a spiritual perspective, the most important effect of occasionalism is not theoretical clarity, but existential wakefulness. If the world endures only because God recreates it at every instant, then nothing is guaranteed, even a heartbeat from now. The continued beating of the heart itself is a new act of giving. This can be terrifying if imagined in isolation, as if each moment were perched on the edge of random annihilation. Ghazali pairs it, however, with his trust in divine wisdom and mercy. The same God who chose the best of all possible worlds is the one who renews it. The fragility of creation is thus set within the steadiness of the Creator. This way of seeing also softens the fear of causes. If you succeed in something, you need not be haunted by the thought that perhaps you have wrested control from God. Your success is simply one more instance of his habit of joining effort to result. If you fail despite your labor, you are freed from the illusion that the cause should have forced the effect. There is space for patience, gratitude, and supplication. You still tie your camel, as the prophetic saying goes, but you know that the knot holds only because God holds it. In the background of Ghazali's engagement with occasionalism is a subtle negotiation with the philosophical tradition. He does not wholly discard the language of secondary causes. In some contexts, he traces chains of causality through the heavens up to God himself, as if adopting the Avicennan framework. Yet he consistently inserts a qualification: only God is a true agent. Created causes are like shadows moved by a hand. They are honored by being the sites where his wisdom appears, but they never own the power they display. To live inside such a universe is to inhabit a peculiar mixture of security and contingency. Security because nothing escapes the will that recreates all things. Contingency because no created pattern is absolute. Tomorrow need not resemble today. The sun could rise in the west, and it would not be a violation of some independent natural law, only a change in divine custom. Most of the time, however, God chooses not to bewilder his servants. He lets the frames of the film line up smoothly so that we can walk, remember, and plan. When we pause to meditate on this, the ordinary world begins to look different. The repetition of dawn becomes less obvious, more astonishing. The fact that a thought can follow a thought, that a sentence can be finished, that a promise made yesterday can still be kept today, all of this becomes fragile and precious. For Ghazali, This is not an invitation to paralysis. It is an invitation to presence. Each moment is an encounter that will never recur in the same way. Each is made from nothing by the same one who made the first moment of the cosmos. In the end, occasionalism and the atomic structure of time are, for Ghazali, less about constructing an alternative physics than about clearing space for a certain mode of worship. A world composed of self-sustaining causes encourages the soul to lean on them. A world composed of perishing moments, each upheld by an unperishing will, invites the soul to lean elsewhere. It invites a trust that is not naive about the patterns of nature, but that also refuses to turn those patterns into idols. In such a world, causality itself becomes a sign, pointing beyond every frame of time to the one who, without effort, brings the next frame into being. Part 16. The fire and the cotton denying necessary connection. Within ordinary life, the link between cause and effect feels almost sacred. Strike a match, and the flame appears. Touch a flame to cotton, and it burns. We move through the world as though these patterns were not just regular, but fixed in the very bones of reality. Al-Ghazali takes this seemingly innocent confidence and holds it up to the light. In the 17th discussion of the Incoherence of the Philosophers, he chooses a humble image, fire and cotton, to ask a radical question. When we say that fire burns cotton, what are we really claiming? Are we simply describing a pattern we have seen again and again? Or are we secretly making a much bigger claim that fire must burn cotton, that it cannot be otherwise? His aim here is not to play clever games with language. He is defending something central to revelation, the possibility of miracles. If the world is locked into an iron web of necessary connections, then many of the prophetic signs told in Scripture, like fire that does not burn, or lifeless matter that suddenly lives, become impossible by definition. Al-Ghazali wants his philosophical opponents to admit that these events are at least possible. Only then can a Muslim philosopher, who also believes in revelation, be honest about what the Quran describes. To do this, he begins with an opening move that is both simple and subtle. Any acceptable explanation of what happens in the physical world, he says, must satisfy four conditions. First, the connection between what we call a cause and what we call its effect cannot be necessary in itself. There must be room, at least in principle, for that connection to have been otherwise. Second, the effect must be able to exist without this particular cause. Not that it actually does, but that it is not bound to this one agent, as though no other path to it were even conceivable. Third, the two events we observe, the heating of the cotton and its combustion, for example, are brought into being together, side by God. They do not emerge from one another by their own power. Fourth, this joint creation follows a prior divine decision, a taqdir, a decree and measure chosen by God's free will. On the surface, this list sounds like the program of a strict occasionalist. No real causes in the world, only God producing events directly, moment by moment. Many readers have taken it exactly this way, yet as later scholars have noticed, Al-Ghazali's language is more spacious. Even an Avicennian philosopher can say that God creates causes alongside effects through a chain of secondary causes. The question is not whether there is a chain. The question is whether the links in that chain are necessary or chosen. Al-Ghazali's first move, then, is to loosen our grip. When we see fire touch cotton and then see the cotton ignite, what have we actually witnessed? We have seen two events occur together in a stable pattern. We have not seen an invisible bond that forces one to follow from the other. He insists on this distinction. Observation, by its very nature, can show us only that two things are conjoined. It cannot reveal that they are necessarily connected. We see that whenever fire touches dry cotton under ordinary conditions, burning follows. But to go further, to say that burning must follow, that it is impossible for fire to touch cotton without burning it, this is an extra step. That step is not given in sight or touch. It is added by the mind. For some thinkers, that extra step becomes absolute. They treat the proximate cause as fully sufficient. The fire alone, they say, is the efficient cause of burning. Nothing more is needed. In another work, Al-Ghazali calls such people materialists. They deny a creator for the world. In their view, the chain of causes rests on nothing beyond itself. He also includes in this first position a theological view known as Taulad, which claims that human beings produce their own actions and their immediate effects in full independence. On this account, when you throw a stone and it shatters glass, your power alone is the creator of both the throw and the shattering. Against this, Al-Ghazali offers a simple analogy. A father is certainly a cause of his son's existence, but he is not the only cause. The son's coming to be depends on many conditions and on a whole order beyond the father's control. In the same way, the fire we see is not the whole story. It may be only the last link in a long chain of causes that begins beyond the visible world. In the cosmology of his time, that chain might run through the celestial spheres and their intellects, which religious language called angels. All of them, in turn, depend upon and are moved by God. What looks to our eyes like a simple pair, fire and burning, is for Al-Ghazali a complex network with God as the ultimate efficient cause. Yet even this network does not answer his deeper worry. Philosophers like Avicenna agree that God is the first cause and that there are intermediate causes between God and the events we see. But they also insist on something stronger, that the whole order of causes, from top to bottom, flows with necessity from God's own essence. Given what God is, they say, this world, and only this world, could exist. Given what fire is, this effect, and only this effect, can follow. It is this necessity that Al-Ghazali resists. He does not deny that there are stable patterns in the world. He does not even deny that there may be real connections between things established by God. What he denies is that these connections are necessary in the way his opponents claim. He denies that they arise without divine choice. The image of fire and cotton becomes his testing ground. If you assume that fire burns by its own nature, and that this nature operates necessarily, then a miracle such as Abraham entering the fire unharmed becomes inconceivable. If, however, you recognize that your experience shows only regular conjunction, not inner necessity, then another possibility opens. God can create heat in the fire, and yet withhold burning from the body he wishes to protect. He can create the contact without creating the usual effect. On this view, our trust in the world is real, but conditional. The order of events is not a prison that holds even God. It is a decision, a stable choice he has made. Fire burns cotton whenever he creates burning in its presence. The chain of causes, however intricate, remains dependent at every level on a will that is free. Al-Ghazali's denial of necessary connection, then, is not a rejection of science, nor a rejection of order. It is a rejection of self-sufficient nature. It is a reminder that what appears as an automatic machine is, at a deeper level, a continuous act of giving. To live with this awareness is to see every event as resting, finally, on someone rather than something. It is to see the spark in the cotton, and beneath it an unbroken generosity that does not owe us its constancy, yet grants it moment after moment. Part 17. Contingency and the nature of possibility. Elsewhere, philosophers and theologians might agree on the facts and yet diverge on the words they use to describe them. Necessary, possible, impossible. These seem like clear terms. But for Al-Ghazali and Avicenna, they do not mean the same thing at all. To understand why Al-Ghazali denies that causal connections are necessary, we have to step back from fire and cotton and ask a more abstract question. What do we mean when we say that something is possible or necessary? Where do these notions lie? In things, or in the mind that thinks about them? Avicenna inherits and refines an Aristotelian way of speaking about modality. In that tradition, necessity and possibility are closely tied to time and to the actual course of events in this one world. Take the sentence, fire causes cotton to combust. If, whenever this sentence is uttered, it is true, then it is called necessary. If its truth can vary, true at some times, false at others, it is called possible. If it is always false, it is impossible. On this view, modal terms are measurements of how a certain statement behaves across the history of the world as it actually unfolds. For Avicenna, because fire always has and always will burn cotton under the relevant conditions, the statement is necessary. The necessity is read off from the unbroken regularity of the pattern. Al-Ghazali, shaped by the Asharite theological tradition, finds this picture too narrow. It treats our actual world as the only theatre in which necessity and possibility can be judged. But for him, the heart of modality lies elsewhere, not in the statistics of what has always happened, but in the range of what could have happened. Asharite thinkers developed a way of speaking about God as the one who particularizes. Out of many imaginable configurations, God chooses this one to exist here, and that one to exist there. Every feature of the world, the height of a building, the time a plant sprouts, the moment a person is born is an actualization of one option among many. Al-Juwayni, one of Al-Ghazali's great teachers in this tradition, describes a basic impulse in the mind. When a rational person looks at a building, he says she immediately knows that it could have been different. Higher or lower, wider or narrower, built at another time, in another place. She cannot even think about its current state without, at the same time, sensing these alternatives in the background. This immediate awareness is what they call contingency. The building is as it is, but it did not have to be so. another arrangement was conceivable. The mind, in grasping the actual, grasps at the same time that it might have been otherwise. Here possibility does not depend on what has ever actually happened. It depends on what the mind can conceive without contradiction. Necessity, in turn, is what must be the case in every conceivable arrangement. Possibility is what can be the case in at least one conceivable arrangement. The impossible is what cannot be coherently thought in any arrangement at all. Al-Ghazali applies this to causality when he says that the connection between cause and effect is not necessary. He is not claiming that we will one day see it fail. He is claiming, rather, that an alternative connection can be conceived. Even if in fact the pattern never varies, it remains contingent because it could have been otherwise in the realm of intelligible possibilities. This is a crucial shift. Avicenna tends to locate possibility in things themselves. A possible being for him is one whose essence does not include existence. Existence must be added to it, as it were, by a cause. Possibility in this sense seems to require a substrate, a thing that has the potential to receive existence or an effect. Al-Ghazali pushes back. Modal notions, he argues, belong primarily to our judgments, not to the inner structure of things. When we say that something is possible, we are saying that its existence does not contradict reason. When we say it is necessary, we are saying that its non-existence would be unthinkable. These are features of our conceptual landscape, not hidden powers slumbering inside objects. From here, the disagreement over fire and cotton comes into focus. For Avicenna, the fact that fire has always burned cotton, and always will, shows that the connection is necessary. There is no time at which the sentence, "fire burns cotton," comes out false. The world has revealed its law. For Al-Ghazali, this same fact shows only that God has chosen a constant habit. It does not erase the mind's power to imagine another world, equally coherent, in which the rule is different. We can picture a creation where contact with fire cools rather than heats, or where it has no effect on cotton at all. Such a world would be deeply strange from our point of view. Many of our other expectations would also have to change. Yet it is not unthinkable. The very act of being able to imagine it is significant. It means that the connection we now observe is not necessary in the strongest sense. God could have chosen, in his takdir, to bring about a world with different regularities. Our present order is one possible world among others. It is contingent. Notice what this does to the question of miracles. If necessity is defined by what has always happened in this one history, then the very idea of an event that breaks the pattern threatens the meaning of necessity itself. A single exception would overturn the claim that the connection is necessary. If, however, necessity is defined over the space of conceivable alternatives, then the picture changes. The constancy of a pattern across time does not by itself grant necessity. It simply shows us what God in this world has willed to repeat. Miracles in this light are not violations of a metaphysical law. They are rare choices within a larger field of possibilities known completely only to God. Al-Ghazali thus preserves both sides of our experience. On one side, the stability of the world. We wake to mornings that reliably follow nights. fire continues to burn. Water continues to quench thirst. On the other side, the sense that everything we see rests on a choice that might have been otherwise. The world is steady yet fragile in its dependence. This understanding of contingency also answers a deeper claim in Avicenna's system. For Avicenna, the entire cosmos is the necessary effect of God's essence. Given what God is, this world flows forth without deliberation or alternative. No other complete world is truly possible. Al-Ghazali replies by appealing again to the mind's reach. We can conceive different total orders of things, different arrangements of natures and laws, without contradiction. We can imagine a world in which no human ever exists, or one in which there is no fire at all, or one in which the moral and physical orders are arranged differently. To say that only this world is possible is, from his perspective, to close our eyes to what our own intellect discloses. For him, this world is not the only possible effect of God. It is the world God freely chose from among alternatives known to him, in a way we cannot fathom. To call it contingent is not to belittle it. It is to recognize that its being so is a gift rather than a logical necessity. In such a vision, possibility is not a vague openness. It is the shadow of divine freedom as it appears to the finite mind. The fact that we can think it could have been otherwise is a quiet sign that the world rests on will, not on blind inevitability. And that insight, for Al-Ghazali, is what safeguards the meaningfulness of prayer, hope, and trust. If the causal order were necessary in itself, there would be no room left for a God who chooses. If the order is contingent, then beneath every regularity we see, there remains a living decision that sustains it. Consider miracles. For many, they are the sharp edge where faith and philosophy collide. Do they reveal a tear in the fabric of nature? Or do they expose the limits of what we have so far understood? Al-Ghazali's discussion of miracles grows directly out of his reflections on causality and possibility. Once he has loosened the idea of necessary connection, he turns to a natural next question: how exactly does God act in the world? Does he always create events directly, with no real causes in between? Or does he usually work through secondary causes, through the natures and powers of created things? In the 17th discussion of the Incoherence, Al-Ghazali stages this question as a debate with Avicenna over miracles reported in Revelation. Avicenna's concern is clear. If the natures of things are fixed and their effects follow necessarily from those natures, then certain Quranic miracles become impossible. Wood cannot turn into a living snake. Fire cannot cease to burn. Iron cannot become soft like wax. Al-Ghazali replies with two approaches, two different ways of understanding the relation between God, nature, and extraordinary events. The first approach is boldly occasionalist. Here he denies that created things have any real natures that produce effects. What we call a cause and its effect are simply two events that God creates together, according to a habit he has chosen. On this picture, when fire touches cotton and the cotton burns, it is not because of a hidden power in the fire. It is because God, who already knows eternally every event that will occur, chooses at that moment to create both the contact and the combustion. He has decided in his unchanging knowledge to let these two events appear side by side whenever those conditions are met. The stability of the pattern is nothing other than divine custom ada. God repeats his act in a regular way. That repetition gives rise to what we call laws of nature. But the law does not belong to the things. It belongs to God's way of acting. A miracle within this first approach is simple to describe. It occurs when God interrupts his usual habit. The fire touches, but he does not create burning. The knife is drawn across a throat, but he does not create cutting or death. There is no need to twist the nature of fire, or to imagine a special property infused into the knife. The only difference is in God's choice of which events to bring into being together at that moment. This view makes divine freedom vivid. Nothing in creation binds God. Every moment is a direct expression of his will. Yet it also raises questions. If there are no real natures, how do we make sense of science, of medicine, of any attempt to understand and predict the world? Are all such efforts resting on an illusion? Al-Ghazali's second approach speaks to that concern. Without abandoning his insistence on God's ultimate agency, he now allows that created things may indeed have fixed natures and stable causal connections. Fire may really have a burning nature. Wood may really have a certain capacity to transform over time. The world may contain regular processes that are, in themselves, intelligible. In this second causal theory, miracles do not require the annihilation of nature. They require only that our current understanding of nature is limited. There may be hidden causes or rare combinations of causes that produce effects we find astonishing. Take the famous story of Moses' staff. He throws a wooden stick to the ground, and it becomes a living serpent. To Avicenna, this looks flatly impossible. Wood and living flesh belong to different species. The transformation violates the necessary order of forms. Al-Ghazali invites us to look again at processes we already accept. We know that wood decays, becomes soil, nourishes plants, which in turn feed animals, and so on. Over long periods, matter that was once wood can indeed end up as part of an animal's body, even part of a snake. What if, he suggests, there is some hidden cause, unknown to us, that can compress or redirect this long chain of changes, producing in a moment what usually takes years? Then the transformation of the staff is not a contradiction of nature, but an extreme, swift realization of possibilities already latent in the created order. It remains a sign from God, because only he controls the hidden causes and their arrangement. Yet it does not tear the web of causality. It passes through its finer threads. In offering such examples, Al-Ghazali is not claiming to know how these miracles actually happened. His aim is more modest and more radical. He wants to show that the philosophers have no right to declare them impossible. Their understanding of nature is partial. The range of what God can do through means that lie beyond our theories is far wider than they have allowed. Are these two approaches in conflict? Some readers, noticing how different they sound, have taken them as evidence that Al-Ghazali never really abandoned occasionalism, and that any causalist language is just a rhetorical lure for philosophers. Others have argued the opposite, that he was moving away from occasionalism toward a more Avicennian picture. If we look at his broader work, another possibility appears. In later writings, Al-Ghazali continues to use both ways of speaking. Sometimes he describes an explicitly occasionalist cosmos, where God alone is the true agent and created things are like shadows cast by his will. At other times, especially when reflecting on ethics and spiritual development, he speaks of causes and effects in a more familiar, quasi-Avicennian tone. Yet in none of these works does he clearly say that the cause is truly connected to its effect. He leaves open, at a deep level, whether God always acts directly or usually acts through secondary causes. He even states, near the end of his life, that the question of whether God creates, through the mediation of his creatures, cannot be decisively settled. This undecided position is not a weakness in his eyes. It is honesty about the limits of our knowledge. Observation cannot tell us whether there is an inner necessity binding causes to effects. Revelation tells us that God acts with wisdom and that he sustains the world in an ordered way. It does not, however, disclose the metaphysical mechanics of how his power relates to created powers. For Al-Ghazali, we therefore have to hold both pictures as live possibilities. God may be creating each event directly, using created things only as occasions. Or he may have endowed things with stable, causal roles and chosen to act through them ordinarily. In either case, his freedom and sovereignty remain intact. What allows this suspension of judgment is another conviction he holds firmly, that once God chose this world, with its particular order, he chose also not to change that order arbitrarily. The habits of God are themselves stable. He finds support for this in the Quranic language of God's Sunnah, his way or habit with his creation. You will not find any change in God's habit, the verse says. Al-Ghazali cites this repeatedly to stress that, while God could have created a different order, he has informed us that the order he has chosen will not be capriciously overturned. From this angle, miracles take on a different hue. They are not afterthoughts where God suddenly steps into a machine that was running on its own. They are built into the very design of the machine, so to speak, from the beginning. In God's eternal knowledge and decree, the unusual events we call miracles are already woven into the fabric of his habit. If we imagine the world as purely occasionalist, this means that God's pattern of creating events, though free, is fixed in its overall shape. He has decided that, under such and such conditions, he will usually create burning with fire and cotton, and in rare, special cases he will not. If we imagine the world as ruled by secondary causes, it means that the causal network itself was designed with rare, remarkable pathways that will be activated at certain moments. Either way, there is no randomness here. There is constancy and exception, both grounded in the same wise will. For us, the two cosmologies, strict occasionalism and governed secondary causality, are practically indistinguishable. In both, the world is reliable enough for science and open enough for science. This finally is Al-Ghazali's point. You can study nature without fear that you are encroaching on God's domain. You can trust that bread will usually nourish and that medicine will usually heal. At the same time, you can believe, without intellectual embarrassment, that God can bring about events beyond our models, whether by suspending his usual habit or by activating hidden causes that lie outside our grasp. To live in such a world is to walk a path between presumption and anxiety. On one side lies the arrogance that treats natural laws as absolute, leaving no room for divine choice. On the other side lies the panic that sees every event as chaotic, making trust and planning impossible. Al-Ghazali invites us instead into a quieter posture. The patterns of the world are gifts of a steadfast generosity. They are habits of God, not chains upon him. Miracles are not rebellions against order, but rare, luminous folds within it, intended as signs. Whether God acts directly at every moment, or usually through the natures he has created, our task is the same: to seek understanding with humility, to act responsibly within the order we know, and to remember, in the ordinary and the extraordinary alike, that the true agent behind all things is one.